Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to you wherever in the world you are. Did I get that right, Rob?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
So today our Why Shakespeare class at Harvard is honored to be joined by Robert Miles, creator of The Show Must Go Online, which our class has been studying, thinking about, talking about, and writing about for the past month. Robert Miles is a multi-talented, multifaceted, multidisciplinary, multimedia artist, not yet a multimillionaire, but just you wait. Among other inventions, he is the author of the historical adventure novel Ragnarok, the Last Viking, and a pocket-sized acting toolkit called the Shakespeare Deck. Of Shakespeare's characters, he has played Banquo, Benedict, Barone, Bottom, Brutus, and those are just the ones that start with the letter B. On March 19th, 2020, 8 days after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, as schools, offices, and theaters are shutting down, The Show Must Go Online launches its first socially distanced, fully online performance, The Two Gentlemen of Verona. Over the next 8 months, the group performs each of Shakespeare's 36 plays, one per week, in the order that they are believed to have been written. So we're now just 2 days shy of the 1-year anniversary of The Show Must Go Online, and 19 first-year Harvard students who have persevered through a world turned upside down. These upstart crows have each taken on one of The Show Must Go Online Shakespeare productions, and the assignment has been a really nice opportunity for us to think about how this grassroots organization has responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, how new technology is coming into contact with older literature and culture, and how arts matter during times of trouble. On a personal level, I would just say that The Show Must Go Online, the crew, the community, and just the general vibe of the project has put so much good energy into the universe in the past year. Has been a steadfast source of joy and solace, and we are so grateful to have Rob with us here this morning to take some questions, have some conversations. A quick note about format. So some of us, as we're asking our questions, we'll try to take about 5 minutes per play. As we're asking our questions, some of us may try to share a screen with an image or a video. We are aware that we are talking to perhaps the world's leading expert on how to effectively manage a Zoom screen. And so we beg your patience and forgiveness as we try to fumble through the technology here. So I'll toss things over to the students, and we'll work chronologically through Shakespeare's plays, the ones that they're writing about momentarily. But first, Rob, could you maybe just kind of set the stage for us a little bit and say a quick word just about how you first came to Shakespeare?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I came to Shakespeare much as most people in the UK do, which was through my secondary school or high school education. And I hated it. I thought it was boring. I thought it was dull. I thought it was impenetrable. It sucked, etc., etc. And that's a fairly universal experience. And I think the reason behind that is because Shakespeare is supposed to be said and not read. And now that I am a professional actor and a director, I know just how much work and effort goes into interpreting a text, putting it on its feet, and then serving it to the audience with most of the work done so that they can then receive that actively rather than passively receive it. And that's an interesting distinction that we might get to talk about today a little bit. But nevertheless, receive the benefit of that work having been done. Whereas when we meet Shakespeare for the first time, often our way of shaking its hands is to have to do the actor's forensic and dramaturgical text work ourselves from scratch with none of the tools and none of the shared education that Shakespeare's actors would have had in order to be able to do it. And so it's unsurprising that most people's first reactions to being plunged into a pool full of Shakespeare is not always a positive one. However, through my experiences extracurricularly, I ended up getting involved in acting. I went to a state school in the UK that didn't have a drama course. And so I had to go on a youth drama program that was funded by the YMCA of all things. And as a result of doing that, I got to take part in some plays. I got to go to Prague once on like a big arts festival thing, which was really exciting. And ended up getting in a couple of little indie films and stuff like that. And I was really excited about the prospect of acting. However, the 18th year of my life occurred, and then it was a matter of going to university and getting a proper degree and doing a proper job, and all that kind of pressures were exerted. And so that's what I went and did. And then when I graduated, I celebrated by spending a year in Japan teaching English. And while I was over there, I reevaluated what my passions were and where my energy was, and I found that I was still most excited about the concept of acting. So I threw everything else in the bin pretty much and pursued that as my life. And you have to be an irrational person to do so. You can't be evaluating this stuff economically, because you would choose it to do anything but. But sometimes you just have to do what you have to do. So I went about doing that. And as a result of that, inevitably, because the best place to start with acting is in theatre, I encountered Shakespeare again, and I was cast as Oberon in a production of Midsummer Night's Dream. And once again, I hated it and found it really frustrating for about the first 3 weeks of rehearsal. It's one of these where you're rehearsing evenings and weekends and stuff like that. Then there was an old vet who had spent some time, by that I mean a veteran rather than a veterinarian, had been involved in shows in the West End and stuff like that way back when. And he just kind of whispered in my ear and he said, "Have you thought about this?" And I can't to this day remember exactly what it was that he told me about, but it might have been iambic pentameter, the idea of this alternating rhythm of soft and strong stresses, or it might have been hitting the verbs and the action words and the doing words that are there in the text, actually lifting out the sense or something of that nature. But it took something, especially with Oberon, that was highly poetic and poetical, and it made it active and it made it ownable. And I was astonished that there was something so simple that I'd never encountered, either in my acting training or when I was studying Shakespeare at school, that could be so useful that I didn't know about. So then I was like, what else don't I know about? And it turned out everything. I didn't know anything about anything, and there was so much to find out. And now, like 13 years on from that day, I'm still learning new things about Shakespeare all the time. I'm still hungrily devouring people's texts and people's interpretations of how to work actively with Shakespeare. And I'm also teaching that stuff now, and I'm also directing now, which is really amazing. But I came to all of that through performing, because ultimately acting is an oral tradition, and Shakespeare, especially in early modern forms of acting, were apprenticed rather than there was no such thing as a drama school. So you had to learn by doing. And that's really what I did. I learned by doing, and I applied myself an audition for as many Shakespeare productions as I could find. I think my peak was I did 10 Shakespeare productions in 1 year, and that was my busiest year. But it gives you an idea of how addictive actually I've found this. It's a little bit like if you play computer games, you've got a map and the part of the map is illuminated and the rest of it's dark. And you're like, oh my God, I've got to push over there. I've got to find out what's there. And that addiction to discovery and to finding new things, it's still there, still as active and as joyful for me and as rewarding for me as it was all those many years ago. So that's a kind of potted summary of my experience with Shakespeare.
Rob, do you want to maybe kind of frame things for us with a little bit? Just kind of take us back to your March 2020 when kind of the pandemic hits, and what's your experience like at home? And then how does the idea for the show must go online come together and then become real within, I think, 8 days?
Yeah, it was really no time at all. It was crazy, and it still is crazy. But at the same time, just the privilege of my life to be a part of it. So it's wonderful. I lost a gig creating immersive. I was going to be creating immersive environments for a multinational throughout April, and I wasn't able to do that because of coronavirus. But on the day that I was informed that the event wouldn't be going ahead, I saw maybe 6 to 8 other friends saying the same thing about jobs that they had, that they'd just been cancelled or they'd just lost them. And it was at that point, my wife had already been down to London recently and had to go down because someone else from her agency was international and was no longer permitted to travel because of COVID. And so Sarah had to go into the lion's den and do it instead. And we didn't really realize at that point quite how much risk might have been involved in that. But fortunately, she was absolutely fine. And we weren't personally affected, unlike millions of others. So very fortunate in that sense. But nevertheless, all the work shut down, as I'm sure it did over there as well. And you could see the ripple effect, and you could see that turning into a kind of tsunami. And so there was a question immediately of what are we going to do, or at least that was the question for me. I am a proponent of stoicism in that we have to focus on what we can control and not panic about what we can't, to the extent that that's possible. And so the question was, what can we do? Through my corporate work, I was already familiar with Zoom because I've been working with international clients and having to teleconference. And so I already was aware of this tool. And I knew that on Zoom, you could turn your camera off, you could turn your microphone off, and I knew that there was gallery view. And from there, it was a small leap to think, well, that's an entrance. You turn your camera on and you've entered the space, turn your camera off and you've exited the space. Sounds simple now, but at the time, was not something that many people, if any, were thinking about. And so there was this idea of, okay, why don't we start a reading group, a Shakespeare reading group? Because I love Shakespeare. I've been involved in Shakespeare in depth for about 13 years now. And just really love it. And so thought, you know, what do people turn to in a crisis? Shakespeare, let's do this. And just put out a very casual tweet expecting to get maybe 20 replies for me on Twitter would have been the most ever in my Twitter career up to that point. I'm not an influencer, right? I'm not one of those people. But I put a tweet out very casually saying, maybe we should start a reading group on Zoom, do it in the evenings UK time so US people can take part as well if they fancy it. What do you reckon? Put it out. Made dinner, didn't give it a second thought. Several hours later, went back to check Twitter and there were hundreds of likes, so many retweets, all this kind of thing. There were replies from people all around the world being like, oh my God, yes, I'm so in. And so it was like, okay. So then this idea had to transform into a project. And so for that, I turned to my wife, Sarah, who's a really experienced actor, but project manager as well. Again, working with multinationals in the innovation space. And so I said to Sarah, okay, how are we actually going to do this then? What's the nuts and bolts of what we need to get in place? And so we worked together, devising a structure. And then we were very fortunate to have friends that were in big data, which turned out to be really important because we had to set up all kinds of spreadsheets, for lack of a better way of putting it, to actually process applications and things like that. But we also had a friend who works in universities and higher education around kind of equality of access and things of that nature. And so we actually got some help and some consultation designing the form, the very first form that people would see, in order to make sure that that was as intentionally open and inclusive as possible for as many people as possible. Because what our kind of friend told us as a watch out was that you can exclude people without even knowing that you're doing it, and you need to be aware of that, and you need to kind of counterbalance that in these ways and all that kind of thing. So it was really the intention from the beginning to make this for everyone, and that was not only people of different ethnicities or different class backgrounds, but different levels of experience as well. So we had actors that have never said words out loud before in a performance setting taking part in alongside people that were like RSC and Globe veterans and all the rest of it. And so we set that up. Once we set that up, I think we got 300 applications for the first show. So then we had to actually crunch through those and find the people that we were going to kind of do it with. And again, it was really important to us that that first show set up what we were going to be about. So we wanted to make sure that there was an inclusion of all of these different variables that we were looking to include. The form also has a thing about access needs, so that people that have to interact with this virtual space in different ways could be catered to and for. And that's a mission that we're still in pursuit of. That's something that never ends. But it was there from the start, and it's continued to grow as we've gone along consciously. Once we had it cast, we then had 2 days. I think, did we even have 2 days for that one? We might have had 1 day for that one because it was so fast. Because it was just like bang, 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 bang. Let's just get everything done. Like the critical path, if you've heard of that, as like project management. It was like, this done now, this done now, this done now, this done now. And then it was like, and we're in a rehearsal room and we've got no idea what we're doing. And at that point, I just kind of got together with a number of the actors, not even all of the actors for that first performance rehearsed, but got together with everyone that was willing to put up the time and had the time to come and spend it in a kind of communal environment, to work out the conventions, to work out how we could do like letter passes and things of that nature. And immediately we found that once you put actors in a sandbox, once you put creative people in an environment where you say, these are the rules of the game, now play, exciting and unexpected and wonderful things start to happen. And that was when we knew, probably only 24 hours before the audience, that this was a thing and that there was something exciting here to be explored. Unfortunately for us, there was enough to explore about it that it kept its momentum, and we were able to ride that wave that we caught right at the beginning of the pandemic for 36 weeks doing 40 shows. I think, what else did I want to say about that? Just quickly, I can't remember. It might come back to me later, but let's crack on.
Can we turn our attention to the taming of the shrew to get us started thinking about the early days of the show must go online? Fiona, over to you.
Hi, Rob. Thank you again for joining our class today. Being able to receive insight from the director of these plays himself is certainly a unique opportunity. As a reminder, my play is The Taming of the Shrew. During the introduction of its production, Deborah Ann Bird mentioned some of the remarks made by her colleagues. Many of them reasonably critique the content and themes of The Taming of the Shrew. And I'm wondering whether anyone was hesitant to either act in or otherwise produce this play and how the team navigated the theme of domestication and more specifically sexism. Did any actors or actresses ever express signs of discomfort or disbelief during any scenes?
Really good questions. Lots to unpack there. So I'll go one by one, and if I don't catch them all, do pick me up on things that you want to explore further. But one thing that I just feel like we need to be mindful of is survivorship bias. So you may have seen that meme of like planes full of holes, and it's like, we need to put the armor there. And it's like, no, we don't, because those are the ones that come back. So we put the armor elsewhere. So survivorship bias, we got loads and loads of applications for Taming of the Shrew, but what we can't tell you is who chose not to apply. So I am almost certain that there will be people that chose not to apply to Taming of the Shrew because of its themes. But I don't have that information. I only have the information about those that did. So there's an interesting vacuum there just for us to be mindful of. Also, interestingly, and I didn't know this until it came up on Twitter, was Emily Ingram, our associate director, stage manager, master of props, all-round amazing person, actually auditioned us by watching our production of Taming of the Shrew to see how we handled it. And I went to Emily and I said, that was really interesting. I didn't know that. What made you decide to get involved after having seen it? And Emily said that it was essentially down to, and I may be paraphrasing here, so forgive me if I'm speaking imperfectly, but she said that it was essentially that we didn't try to fix the play, or we didn't try to solve the play. We didn't try to give the audience answers. We asked the questions that the play asks. So there is sexism in the play. There is domestic violence, there's psychological violence in the play. It's absolutely there. And it deserves to be critiqued through that lens, but it also deserves to be examined as to the why that's there. It is my hope that the play was designed to provoke discussion in its original setting, and that the events of the play are not as they could be interpreted, how to fix a broken woman who has ideas above her station and therefore has something wrong with her. That is the framing device, I suppose, that is placed on the play by the Christopher Sly prologue and all that kind of thing. But I think if you look at the role of the wife in other plays, Portia and Calpurnia in Julius Caesar, if you look at Lady Percy and Hotspur, Shakespeare's characters ignored their wives at their peril. If they did not respect their intelligence, if they did not respect the arguments that they were making, and they went ahead with what they were intending to do anyway, they died. And so there's evidence elsewhere in the canon to suggest that Shakespeare's conception of women was not as flat and as regressive as it is in Taming of the Shrew. When it comes to staging it, there are several options. One option, which we didn't go with, but I've seen and works very effectively, is around audience complicity. So it's important to remember that Taming of the Shrew and all early modern work takes place in a shared light. So the audience are there and the performers know they're there, and the actors and the audience know that the actors know that they're there. And the dialogic relationship that you have with the audience is something that we really tried to keep foremost in our minds when we were working on the show. And audience complicity is something that was a really difficult challenge with Zoom theatre, because you're not in the same space when you're live streaming to YouTube, so it's hard to get that there. But we tried in various ways. But as far as Taming of the Shrew was concerned, I've seen it done before very effectively, where it's treated like Punch and Judy. It's treated as a heightened slapstick and a simplistic two-dimensional version of the interactions that Caterina and Petruchio have. And then the last speech of Katerina three-dimensionalizes the character, and like at the end of The Sixth Sense, when it's like it was dead all along, you watch the whole thing through a new lens. When you three-dimensionalize and humanize Katerina, and you see the fact that actually you have been, as an audience, laughing at psychological and physical abuse and violence, it really makes you examine yourself and what you have been complicit in. And it is a sturdy provocation of strong feelings and also powerful thoughts. And I think that is a valid way to look at dramaturgically the staging of the play, in a way that means that you're not supporting patriarchy and you're not supporting violence against women, even if you choose to portray that violence humorously. When we did our version of it, the actors that we had playing both Katerina and Petruchio were extremely experienced Shakespearean actors, veteran actors playing both roles. That was deliberate because we knew that this was going to be tap dancing on a minefield, and they had to be skilled enough and adept enough to be able to do that effectively. But it also meant that I wanted to make sure that they had agency over the roles, because the last thing that I would want as a director is for someone to say, this director made me do this and made me go through this as Katerina. And that oh God, it's giving me shivers just thinking about it. And so because of that, what was interesting was that both of them had a gentler interpretation of both characters than maybe I had seen, or maybe I might have advocated for had I not consciously decided to modulate my approach to the play based on its themes. And I think what's nice about that is that it allows us to sit in what I would refer to as a useful ambiguity. I think so much of theatre and early modern theatre is about involving the audience and enfranchising the audience in the discussion. And I think our introductions with academics can really help with that, because it shows you the play being discussed before you even see it. So you're prepared to ask questions about it. And those academics don't know what we've been rehearsing. So they can sometimes bring things to the front that are nothing to do with the way that we've produced it. And that dissonance can open up then further thought for exploration, all that kind of thing. But we didn't try to fix it. So we didn't we didn't adapt the play, for one. We did the play as the play is written. We didn't try and ameliorate it. So we didn't try to make it seem more palatable or nice. And we didn't try to excuse it. We didn't say it's of its time, therefore it's okay for us to laugh at it now. And I think with this play, it was very much more about what we chose not to do and that driving us toward what happened, rather than us going, this is our direct vision and this is what we're pursuing, this is what we're going after. So with these problem plays, if you like, there's a different way that you have to engage with them. And I think part of that is allowing the people who have to inhabit those roles a degree of agency over how they are presenting key moments in the text. At the same time, one of our kind of commandments is about following the dramatic intention of the text. And I think as provocative as it is a comedy and it is meant to be funny. And what we didn't want to do was flatten or deaden the comedy that is present in the text as well, just because it also has really provocative and dangerous themes. And I think if you can heighten the comedy, you heighten the danger and you heighten the contrast between the two things, and they shine brighter for being placed in opposition to each other. And I choose to believe, and I operate from the position that contrast was deliberate.
It's such a fascinating case, because the design of the Show Must Go Online project kind of requires the Taming of the Shrew to come early, but it's such a risky play. And there are so many considerations you have to keep in mind. And it's a fascinating kind of challenge to have to deal with that very, very early in the trajectory of the project. And I encourage folks to go take a look at the Q&A and the Taming of the Shrew, where there's a little bit more time to get into this. Can we kind of turn our thinking now to the early days of the Show Must Go Online and Richard III? Lucas, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you very much to Mr. Miles today for joining us. It's a huge honor. So yeah, my name is Lucas. I'm analyzing Richard III. I asked previously on the Twitter thread about how you navigated having sort of a limited amount of extras on screen at one time because of the nature of Zoom. And Richard III, in a few scenes, it sort of needs this sort of support. So I was thinking about how did you think then about ways to portray very sort of triumphant scenes and sort of ways to invigorate the audience when you need like sort of a large amount of people to go like, yeah, like stuff like that. So do you still seek to do that? Do you still seek to sort of imbue that, or do you try to go about more cynical approach?
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. I would say we rarely, if ever, took a cynical approach in that we always tried to serve the dramatic intention or the dramatic function of the text to the extent that we were capable. So that was always something that was foremost in our minds. When looking at how to do that without huge casts of supernumeraries and spear carriers and the like, it's worth pointing out that Richard III, up to that point, and I think maybe ever, was our largest ensemble cast, because the play has the largest number of speaking roles in it. And so it was our biggest, most ambitious piece. It was also the first time that we had actors returning to the show that had done it before. So people that actually had a little bit of a working knowledge of the play, or rather of the doing of plays via Zoom and doing them in our style, that were therefore able to climb that ladder an extra rung maybe than people that were coming in and starting from scratch and starting from the first from the kind of word go, really. So it had a number of actors that had now had a chance to be immersed in this way of working and to stretch the boundaries of how that works and things like that. We'd also, in the early histories and Henry VI's, managed to get hold of a Foley artist who would actually put together sound beds for us to use. And I think in many cases, the idea of scale and the scale being off stage was how we kind of conceptualized it. And so there would be battle noise, but you would hear that in the scene transitions, and you would hear that in kind of moments so that you could infer that it was going on. You just didn't actually manage to, what am I trying to say? I've slightly lost my thread, sorry. We didn't manage to show it, but we could use other senses in order to evoke it at moments, so that at least if you were going into a scene, I believe Richard III was the time where Zoom wouldn't let us play sound beds underneath dialogue, and that was a feature that came in later on, and we used it to that effect later on. But I believe by Richard III, we were still at the point where it was only in the scene transitions, so it was kind of like a frame for the picture to sit in. So you say, this is the context, and you as an audience have to carry that with you now in your imagination into the piece. And it's informed really by Henry V and the first chorus speech, "Oh, for a muse of fire," right? Let us on your imaginary forces work. It was a matter of giving you cues and giving you bits of material that you as an audience could then try and embroider and extrapolate while the technology was limiting us in that way. What else? Sorry, I've just got a related question here. Did TSMGO make an effort to cast new actors for every show? Yes, very much so. Very much so. And you will see that as the chronology goes along, there are faces that do recur, and it kind of, you see a higher number of recurring faces as we go along, but there's still always new people involved right till the end. We still had new actors involved in The Tempest, which was our final ever show. And we wanted to make sure that everyone leaves with a biscuit was the logic, that everyone that came in would get a rewarding experience that would teach them something, and whether that's about Shakespeare or about Zoom acting or about whatever is up to their particular experience and what they were particularly engaging and applying it for. But we wanted to make sure that because Show Must Go Online is completely voluntary, that it would be a value-added experience for those who volunteered their time, and they would get something in exchange for it, even if it wasn't remuneration. Yes, very much so. Does that go some way towards answering the question, Lucas?
Yeah, absolutely. I
Awesome.
mean, I was sort of wondering a little bit about the sound bites. I didn't actually realize sort of like the process it took to get there, but that's really fascinating. So thank you very much.
Sure. Sorry, Jeffrey.
I was going to ask a quick follow-up about the actors who showed up several times, and were there any cases that stood out where the way an actor played a role in an earlier play kind of spilled over into the way that you thought about how that actor was performing in a later play?
Actually, yes and no. That's a double-edged sword in some ways, because sometimes we would deliberately provoke an actor to give us something very different in a different casting. So we had seen them, yes, we can see that you're capable of doing X, Y, or Z. And, a great example of that is Stephen Leask. Stephen Leask applied for comedies, is very good at comedies, and that's what he wanted to do. And so we were happy to use him, to deploy him in that way. But then there are other characters who have played a mix of comic and tragic roles, a mix of supporting and lead roles, all that kind of thing. But I'd say another good example of someone that we did see the potential in, if you like, would be Ruth Page, who played Clifford in one of the early Henrys and then played Henry V later on. And it was because of what she was able to do with Clifford, which was quite a kind of small role, but with a nice set piece speech, that made us feel like that would be an interesting choice, So yeah, absolutely. There was a combination of inspiration and also disruption, I guess, in terms of the recurring casting choices that were going on. Yeah. I've just got another one here about the hollowness of Richmond's victory. Should we cover that off quickly?
Yeah, absolutely.
We may as well. I'm fine. My time is yours. I'm not in a rush. So if we want to cover these things off, then we absolutely can. I just thought it was an interesting question. I thought it was interesting that you asked it, because it's the hollow crown cycle. That's how it's been referred to, right? And the hollowness of the victory and the hollowness of the crown, I think for me, is something that's embroidered into the text and is in the structure of the play. Richmond himself is a cipher. There's no Henry VII play. There's a Henry V and there's a Henry VI and there's a Henry VIII, but there's no Henry VII. And that's a weird, sore thumb. And Richmond is this kind of vanilla, benign character that is almost just there to get us back to a status quo and to kind of tie the houses together. And the idea that he's a bit of a non-event, I think, is interesting in terms of, if you took too strong a position, or if you had too strong of a personality, would you just perpetuate the feud instead of ending it? And there's really interesting questions to be asked about the role of Richmond dramaturgically in that piece. And I think that the lack of bloodshed, if you like, in our production, we'd had mud and blood in shows up to that point, so it may have been a function of the actors not being willing to cack their faces in jam. Or it may have been a matter that people didn't have time in between scenes to get that stuff applied before they had to reoccur. It could be anything of that nature. I think it's not blockbuster in the way that it's sometimes portrayed. And I think that does allow you to have a greater focus on the personal dilemmas that are going on in that piece. I think also, again, just on the nondescriptness of Richmond, Richard thinks he's killed him umpteen times. That he's like, I've killed Richmond 5 times already. And it's like, he's so bland that his clothes maketh the man, right? Even Richard doesn't know if it's really him or not. I think there's just something about his blank slate that I think is an interesting seam to mine, potentially. It's a bit of the play that not a lot of people focus on. So the fact that you did, to me, just felt interesting.
So if we can shift our thinking over to Love's Labor's Lost, Sam, can we toss to you?
Sure. So thank you again for coming and speaking with us. Everything you just said about Taming the Shrew was really great to hear, and a lot of really interesting stuff. So like Wilson said, I'm looking at Love's Labor's Lost, and I really loved your guys' production of it. I thought it was really great. So I was just interested in your production. You chose to have Mott portrayed as a stereotypical teenager, the hoodie and the phone. And you have, phones used a couple of times throughout the play, Mott films Armado's conversation with Jack and Etta. Mott is Longueville is holding up his phone when Armado's about to fight Costard, at the end. And I thought those were really interesting choices that I didn't really expect, going to watching your production. And I was just really interested on your thinking of, why phones, why there, and sort of what were you hoping to add to the scenes by adding these sort of small details?
Absolutely. So I think there's a question of scene and there's a question of character. And I think the mobile phone kind of does straddle that line. And I think it's interesting. I think one is the idea of making the plays feel like they're for now, I suppose, and that these are things that people have at their disposal that can be embroidered into a play sympathetically with the text if you are looking to do so. And so it was an interesting opportunity. I think Moth, as I think it was written in ours, was a twist on the clever servant archetype from Commedia dell'arte. And the idea is that Moth is cleverer than Don Armado. And the question for me was around, what is it like to be a clever teenager in a dead-end job? And what are our coping mechanisms with that situation? And one of the ways that we can get ourselves through those situations are things like just stimulation, right? We're trying to stimulate our brains more, and so we're gonna absorb ourselves into our phone. We're gonna hide ourselves with the hoodie, all this kind of thing, right? And we're just trying to disengage from the reality that we're maybe not enjoying in order to do something else that we are enjoying more. And I think it was a way to characterize the clever servant in a way that allowed them to be delinquent, which is another key feature of that archetype in early modern drama, is the fact that they're often disobedient, or whether deliberately or not, they end up being disobedient in one way or another. In this one, you've got, you mentioned in your question about the use of the phone and then apparently making things up. And I thought there was an interesting thing in that with the seawater green complexion of Samson. I think there's something, again, interesting about the ambiguity there in terms of, is it Moth's dependence on technology getting hoodwinked by someone who's pranked Wikipedia and is just giving it verbatim, and it's the danger of a little knowledge is a dangerous thing and fake news, and you've got that kind of theme that you could extrapolate from it. Similarly, you could use Moth's I'm citing a source, therefore I have credibility, to help Moth do the prank, because he's not actually seeing the phone, he's not seeing what's on there. And those are both valid interpretations of that moment. And I think you'd want to go to Alice, who was the character that played it, the actor that played it, to find out what she felt she was doing in that moment. But the other thing that I think phones are useful to enhance is the presence of characters on stage. It's really interesting that he didn't just get Moth to exit while he's talking to Jack and Etta. Moth's there as a witness to that confession of love, to someone who is like base and low of status and not appropriate for him as a Don, right? And Moth filming that and filming him debasing himself and filming him crash and burn is the kind of, again, playing into that delinquency and that idea that you could see them posting this on Instagram Live, and then Don Amado being furious about it when he gets off stage. And it's one of those things where if it wasn't on Zoom, if it was in an auditorium, there would be an account that you could follow, which is Moth, and you would be able to see that on Instagram Live, and we could actually get phones involved in the show instead of them being like, turn them off, put them in a bag, throw them in the river, like, it's so anti-phone in theatre because we're so like sanitized in terms of how audiences are supposed to engage. I think it'd be really fun for people to get their phones out and to be able to watch a scene take place from a character's perspective on stage. So I think that's the seed of the idea that we were kind of playing around with. I think as far as delinquency is concerned as well, there's a juvenile quality to the lads in that play, and they are in need of maturation, they're in need of maturing. And this is a gauntlet that's thrown down to them at the end. But the idea that a fight is going to kick off, and rather than de-escalate it or physically get in between them and try and stop them, the answer is to get this out because it's going to be hilarious and I want to film it and I want to post it on social media, is a way to signal the immaturity of those characters at a really late point in the play, because obviously they've been the victims of a very long gulling when they're like dressing up as the Russians and they don't know that the women actually know who they are, and they've been pranked upon for a lot of the play. And so you have to remind the audience before the King of France dies and the whole timbre, emotional texture of the scene changes, that these guys, the gauntlet that the women in the play are throwing down is a fair one, that they've earned it. And so it was a way for us just to kind of remind the audience of that, I suppose, really.
So to Romeo and Juliet now, and Jonathan, over to you.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. So with Romeo and Juliet, I was wondering, what was your process for planning sort of the camera technique that each actor would use? And sort of how did you plan the cameras to sort of create the vision you had for the performance? And what were the main difficulties of coordinating that over Zoom?
Sure, yeah. So it's a multi-part process. So I'll start at the beginning. The first thing is that we have an R&D where the whole creative team is involved, and we go through the play and we identify what we call set pieces. So what are the big moments in the play? What are the memorable events? What are the key milestones that we want to make matter and that we want to make visually or emotionally distinct? And how we're going to go about doing that. And then we explore that as a team. And through that exploration, we came up with this visual grammar that relies on a number of different cues from TV and film. So I'd say the most influential thing on our style out of necessity was a TV show in the UK called Peep Show, where everything is filmed in first person. And the shot reverse shot is going from one person's eye line to the other person's eye line. And so that was what we were trying to replicate with the camera moves, was if someone's sat towering above you, then they ought to be looking down at their camera. If you are being towered above, then you should be looking up at your camera. We want to try and match those dynamics in between both actors so that you can see it from both of their perspectives. And that's what we kind of thought about in terms of relationship dynamics. So when you've got like Capulet screaming at Juliet, for instance, it might be cool if those two are in that kind of power dynamic, and you see that power dynamic. You see Capulet towering and you see Juliet cowering. Equally, you've got the balcony scene, as it's called. Takes place in an orchard. I don't think there's actually a reference to a balcony, but it's like so famous. Everyone's just like, it's a balcony scene. But it does make sense, and it is dramatically useful to separate them and to allow Romeo to adore her. You know, there is a gallery in the Globe, and we know that she probably would have been up on that gallery. And so we were trying to reenact, I guess, the textual clues that are there in a way that would be functional on Zoom to allow the audience to interpret what the relationship of these characters in space is supposed to be. Because if they're both just flat on and looking straight at the camera, there's nothing to differentiate that from the standard eye line of a regular conversation. So you need to know that something is different, and you need to be able to differentiate it in some way. And the camera angles were the way that we chose to do that. So that was things like that. But then you've also got the fact that the two of them are the only two characters in the piece that use camera movement extensively. And that was deliberate because they are the two most dynamic, and their relationship is the most dynamic entity in the play. They are in the center of the whirlwind, and they're creating all of the movement. And so their cameras are the most mobile and the most moving, if you like, and their relationships are always in flux and changing. And you see that through the relationships. You know, you've got the balcony scene where Romeo is looking up at Juliet and it's all hopeful, and then that's mirrored by his escape through the window when she's looking down on him and saying that you look like you're in the bottom of a grave. So there's things there that have been written by Shakespeare with the architecture of the Globe in mind that we wanted to replicate in order to highlight those dynamics for the audience so they could absorb them more easily than they would in like in a bland read in a flat space. So that's like the second part. The third part is camera choreography, which was, so we had the moment where they kiss, right? And Zoom is the bane of my life for this, in that it puts all the tiles in a random order on everybody's screens, and it's different again on YouTube. So no one has any idea what orientations the two screens are going to be in relationship to each other. And that presents big dramaturgical hurdles to have to overcome. We had this idea that we wanted them to turn and kiss each other in profile. It was something we'd attempted to do in Taming of the Shrew, and it hadn't come off, and we kind of binned it and were like, oh, it's just not possible. But in this, we were like, no, come on, now is the time. We need to make this moment work. How can we get it to work? And we had to do several rehearsal live streams with, and we had to teach the actors several alternatives. So benefits of the scene. There's only the two of them on stage, which means that they can only be in one of two possible relationships to each other. Yes, win. All right, this is exciting news for us. So that means that I either have to turn this way to kiss you, or I have to turn this way to kiss you. And that's relatively easy, right? So that was step one. However, the problem is that this camera does serve as something of a fourth wall, and the actors have been speaking to the camera as each other up until the point where they then kiss. So if I am talking to you, and I go here, they're like, who, the, what are you, what, like we've broken the rules of the world. So what we actually had to do was get the actors to physically move their camera to 90 degrees to the side of them, so that the line of sight that they were on when they were talking, the camera had gotten out of the way and facilitated them coming in together. So that meant that both actors had to create two piles of books and boxes on either side of them, one called A and one called B. And B for both of them would interrelate. So B would be this way for one, this way for the other. So if they both went to B, they would connect up in the middle. And the same with A. On YouTube, we have a 10-second delay between us doing the actions on screen and you actually receiving them on YouTube. So there's like a 10-second lag. The sonnet that they share when they speak to each other immediately before they kiss is approximately 15 seconds, 20 seconds long. In that window, while they're falling in love with each other, they also have to have the live chat open on their screen, and they get one of two instructions: turn to A or turn to B, live on the night while the performance is going on. Because as soon as they get into that sonnet with each other, we can see, right, they need to turn this way. It also requires us to know what A and B mean well enough to spot it and deploy it and not get it wrong and send them in the opposite directions, right? So that's all the stuff that's going on live while you're watching the show. So they do the cinematography, they do the acting, they do the camera choreography, they do the physical choreography, all live on the night, as cued by us as stage management who are watching the live stream and then feeding that back into the Zoom. So there's a lot of work that goes into even something that seems apparently simple. And I think that is an important thing to kind of reckon with when you're creating this kind of work. Just got a related question here. Did you have the same camera difficulties in choreographing the fight scenes? No, we decided to do all of the fight scenes either down the barrel. So everything was just in front of you and the guy that you were fighting was in front of you, and I can block here and I can block here and I can use the edge of the screen to do so. Or I can go through the top of the screen or through the bottom of the screen with my attacks, whatever. And we would use that space to cross the line. So for instance, if I do a slap, I will swing my arm over the top of the screen like this. I'll go, I'm slapping you. And then the other person will go, ow. And they will use their own hand to wipe their face. And it's like it's the other person's hand from the other screen. So we're like crossing over that membrane. But that's because it was too much. Well, most of the actors' movements choreographed in the shows, yes, they were. Purely because the interrelatedness of the moves and the fact that you needed to act and react and respond to things at certain times meant that we had to make sure that most of the moves were choreographed. They were also scheduled to take place on the end of verse lines, so that if I was going to pass you a prop, I would do it at the end, like that. And we would get it there because then the actor has a clearer audio cue for, I know it comes at the end of this line, so I'm going to start reaching out to receive it, I'm going to get it. And it gives our best chance at creating that fluid handover, if you like. From the post-show discussion, all had to be pretty agile. Yes. Favorite anecdotes in this vein? Yeah, I mean, when I was bottom, I blew some bubbles off my hand from the bath. Those flew through the air, landed on my mouse pad, collapsed my text. I opened it up again and it had deleted an entire scene, because if you have headings highlighted, which you do to skip through the scenes quickly, then and you delete the heading, it deletes the whole thing. So then I had to undelete it, find where I was in it, and all this is going on while you're watching it. And I think I say something like, I seem to have forgot myself or something like that. Water and electronics do not go well together. However, at several points we were required to integrate water into the shows, and almost all of those were good times and high stakes times, if you like. So yeah, lots going on there.
That is so amazing. And Rob, it's taken every ounce of organizational capabilities I have in my body just to get you here for a couple hours today. I can't even imagine how much behind the scenes work it takes to pull these things together. But let's kind of keep going with the Midsummer Night's Dream here and toss over to Patrick.
Just quickly, I have a background as a fight choreographer or fight coordinator as well. And I think that physical choreography is something, and that language of physical choreography and of interrelated choreography between two people actually put me in uniquely good stead, along with the benefit of having actual fight choreographers coming on and doing those kind of dedicated fight scenes to take that off my plate. But we were able, because we were already used to physical grammar, I guess, in that way, to be able to teach the actors what we needed to get out of them. And then just a quick question here as well about Romeo as an innocent figure, which I don't mind diving into just quickly if we've got time. Romeo is innocent at the start of the play, I suppose, to the extent that any entrenched gang member can be. I think he's innocent in terms of life experience, certainly. But I think he's a product of his life experiences, and like most other people, is capable of anything. And I think with Romeo, we talk about him being a poet and him being a lover and all this kind of thing, but he also murders Tybalt and Paris. And Paris, he murders pretty much in cold blood. He just does it because he's in his way, and it's quite casual, quite trivial. I know that Paris struggles with the line, "Oh, I am slain." It's to try and deliver without it causing a laugh or causing some kind of awkwardness. But I think for me, when I look at characters like that, I'm trying to find a spine or a core to them that allows them to be more inconsistent and not less. So taking a cue from Meatloaf, I would do anything for love is a great spine for Romeo, because it allows him to be more unpredictable. When Mercutio, who I love, is killed, I can do anything to set that right. When I need to get to Juliet and this guy is in my way, I will do anything to get him out of my way, right? So it's a spine to that character that allows him to be the inconsistencies that he's written as, rather than something that requires us to kind of smooth those rough edges off. It actually allows us to make him spikier in that way. I don't think that makes him inherently a bad person, in terms of, he risks everything in the pursuit of what he wants. He goes after Juliet, he defies his family, he forgets about Rosalind immediately. But he'll also, he talks about exile in the play being a fate worse than death, and he has huge passages of text that are about exactly how bad exile is, and then he endures it for the chance to be with Juliet again. And that temperance, and what motivates him to that temperance when he's been so intemperate with, like, the death of Mercutio, for instance, just shows you what he's willing to go through for this. And I think that's what makes him a compelling character to follow, if not necessarily one to root for all the time. A little bit like, I think Breaking Bad is probably the best example of complex, compelling characters that are interesting to watch, but not necessarily we don't have to lionize them or make them heroes. Cool. Apologies. Right. Midsummer, is it?
Yeah, Patrick, over to you.
Hello again. It's a total honor for you to be here. This has been a lot of fun. You might be you might be excited to know that I've written a whole argument on Bottom specifically, his character, and specifically how your crazy, expressive, totally comic performance might inform a reading of Bottom, where he's more of a central presence in the play, more of a chief character in the interpretation. from what aspects or particular details of Bottom's character did you draw from in conjuring your performance of the character? In particular, what inspired you to unleash at the he stabs himself in the play within a play, just to make that a 6-minute pantomime spectacle? That is,
Yeah.
Why do you think Bottom would create that moment at the end of the play? Because it's distinctly not Shakespeare's. It's like, it's yours or Bottom's or whoever's.
Sure.
And please, if you have any anecdotes to throw in.
Yeah,
Especially
definitely.
with that
I do. So I'll talk through the process first, and then we'll go anecdotes second. But Bottom is middle class. Bottom is a craftsman. Shakespeare's dad was a craftsman. He was a glover. He was a person who worked with his hands. And Shakespeare would have considered himself a middle class craftsman as well, because he's a playwright, and that's WRIGHT, like a shipwright, like someone that builds ships out of wood, right? So he's a practical, hands-on person that is crafting a thing. And Bottom is a craftsman. He crafts, he weaves, right? And I think the fact that he's a weaver, you know, so someone, it's very common to get Dreamweaver as like a pretentious interpretation of weaver. But this idea that he takes things and he resolves them together to create a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts, I think is worth mentioning, and is a textual clue. Some of these clues will be reaches, and I think that's fine if the payoff is worth it. He speaks in prose, which is the next thing, which means that he's motivated by his thoughts more than his feelings. A lot of people see the distinction of prose and verse as high status and low status. And I absolutely don't think that's true at all. For me, it's much more useful to see it in terms of head voice and heart voice. And verse is the heart voice, and when our emotions bubble up and burst out of us, and they drive us to a kind of poetic form. And our prose voice is when we're up in our heads and we're thinking about things from a problem-solving perspective, or from a loyally argumental perspective. You know, Michel de Montaigne was just kind of nailing down what an essay was at this point, which seems unthinkable to us. We're like, the essay has always existed, but it was new. It was new back in these days. And lawyers were a boom industry at the time that Shakespeare was writing. And so the idea of argument through writing and argument through text is something that I approach all Shakespeare with. All Shakespeare is argument. But the arguments that are made in prose are generally more cerebral and less emotionally informed, I suppose. What that means for the mechanicals is that they are dramaturgs. They have a play, and that play presents a series of problems, and these are problem-solving people who want to solve those problems. And all of the discussions and the explorations that they have about the play are all about, but there's another thing. Oh, shit. We've got to have a wall in the Great Chamber. Let's have a guy be a wall, right? It's all about problem-solving. The comedy comes from the novelty, I suppose, of how they choose to solve those problems relative to the dramatic conventions of the time and the period. So I imagine that in Shakespeare's time, obviously Shakespeare was an actor in a company of players. They would have been used to solving dramaturgical problems. And the fun here was about how can we solve these problems badly, or how can we solve these problems in absurd ways, right? And that's because these aren't theatre people. They're people that work real jobs. But I think that idea of problem solving for me was really key to the interpretation of Bottom. They're fixing a play from the perspective of an engineer rather than an artist. And I think that's a nice, and if I was able to do one on stage, it'd be the most Wallace and Gromit, Rube Goldberg machines, like there'd be cranes, and like it looked like a building site, I think, for me, if we could like really explode that concept. In terms of specific textual cues, he has the multiple beards. He says what beard were best to play it in. And for me, that was the root of the extrapolation that became the Mary Poppins bag of props that has like every single possible thing in it that you might need to play whatever character it might be that it gets cast as. And what I like about that is that it adds an unpretentiousness to Bottom, in terms of he's cast as the lead and he's thrilled and simultaneously has no idea what to do about it and doesn't even know who he is, and gets straight into what is this character? What are the problems I'm going to need to solve? How am I going to solve them? What am I going to use to tell this story? And I think I'll finish and then I'll come back. I'll make it like the conclusion. But that's something to bear in mind, is the idea that he doesn't know that he's going to get cast as the lead, and that to me makes him more endearing. The idea of the multiple deaths is extrapolated in part, and full credit to Scott Ellis, who directed me in the role of Bottom in a production years previous to this, for kind of inspiring this approach. It was a different take on it, but it was a similar approach. And it's based on the repetition of the word thus. And in Shakespeare's text, when the word thus is used, it generally indicates that there is an action associated with it, right? We are demonstrating something to the audience. And he says thus 5 times. And that to me suggests that he stabs himself at least 5 times. And if he stabs himself 5 times, that's excessive. And so the clue in the text is Bottom gives himself an excessive and gratuitous death. So then the question was, how excessive, how gratuitous? And we just explode that concept. I think the reason that Bottom can do that, and the reason that Bottom chooses to do that from an in-character perspective, is that he's still solving the problem of the perfect death for Pyramus. I think he sees Pyramus as Hamlet, as the big role to play, right? And he wants to make sure that he gets it right. And in Shakespeare's text, there's loads of examples of what I call self-redrafting, where a character is an imperfect speaker and they say something and then they say it again a different way to improve upon it and to clarify their vision, to clarify their argument. And for me, it was an exploration of self-redrafting, right? Bottom's done this death. Does that nail it? Not quite. We're going to go again. I've had a better idea. And I think that, for me, the inspiration, the idea that light bulbs are constantly flashing in his head and his synapses are constantly connecting new and novel and different things, is part of his superpower as a character. And it's why he's able to accept the idea that he has a donkey head. It's why he has the ability to accept that a goddess is in love with him, that he can accept that he has a train of fairies giving him massages and fetching him food, right? Everyone should find this weird. Bottom finds it weird for maybe 3 lines and then is like, cool, all right. And he has that improv notion of yes and, right? I accept the proposition and I build on it. And I think that's all kind of coming in. The deaths that we did were a metatextual gag in that we did the complete deaths that have been seen in Shakespeare up to that point. So we had the arrow through the neck as Clifford, we had the drowning in the Malmsey butt of Clarence and things of that nature. And it was the idea of rewarding the audience that had showed up week after week. And it was literally meant to be part of what we refer to as a dialogic relationship with the audience. The idea that Shakespeare is happening in shared space and shared light, which is why we don't use green screen backdrops or anything of that nature, because we are doing it in our bedrooms and you're watching it in your bedrooms. We're in a shared space, even if we're thousands of miles away, right? The play is designed to be done that way. And Shakespeare, I believe, would have had followers, if he would have had repeat customers. And he refers back to his own work and refers forward to coming work through the whole canon. And that was something that became really clear once we were doing the chronology. So the idea of referring back to previous pieces and referring forward to future pieces was, again, something that had a basis in evidence in Shakespeare's own practice. All of this is in service of what's funniest. And it would be pretentious not to acknowledge that. The idea was that we've picked up the clues in the text and then we exploded them, and we ended up with this like cartoonish interpretation that is inspired in part by like Buster Keaton, who would do cartoon gags. So I exist in a frame, so that means that I can pull a ludicrous thing out of nowhere that you can't see it before it enters the frame, and now it exists, and then once it's out, it doesn't exist anymore. And that was something that this allowed us to do, whereas if we were doing it on stage, you would have seen me with a massive props table with 15 different things on it, and that would have given all the gags away too early on one thing and another. So we were trying to make best use of the medium in terms of how we approached it as well. So to finish on an anecdote and a conclusion, Bottom for me is a craftsman, is defined by his enthusiasm and his childlike imagination. And his childlike imagination allows him to both embroider things in a ridiculous and stupendous way, and also accept ridiculous and stupendous events happening to him. It's all the same for him. I was sent a very long, and I will say a very angry email by an old hand, an old actor who wanted to explain to me explicitly and in detail how wrong I had gotten the character of Bottom, and how it was an abomination to what Shakespeare had written, and how I had misinterpreted all of the things that are there in the text. And I offer that for balance, because everyone is free to disagree. And when people are interpreting Shakespeare's text, they will interpret it differently. And ultimately that's valid. Whether you decide to like send a whole big email about it is a different question, but other alternatives and interpretations are available. The reason that I like this one is because I have seen Bottoms that are the only actor with a SAG card or whatever. And they are I know better than everyone else, and I've worked in Broadway, darling, and all this kind of thing. And it makes him superior. It makes him punch down on the rest of the mechanicals. And then there's an irony implicit in the fact that he's then terrible, and that can be funny. But I want Bottom to be someone that you can love despite himself, rather than someone who is like a Malvolio who is there to be laughed at. You know, Bottom is there to be laughed at, but in a very different way and with a very different emotional core, I believe, to someone like a Malvolio. And that comes from, again, if you want to justify it dramaturgically, Will Kemp was the guy who almost certainly played Bottom. He left the company before Malvolio came around, and all the fools and the malcontents came in an era that was post-Kemp and post this kind of silly, physical, slapstick, exuberant foolery. So those are the reasons that inform those decisions. And it's up to you whether you agree with them or not. and you're welcome to disagree. Was a death drowning by mums? Yes, it was. Yeah, Clarence in Richard III. Yeah, so yeah, multiple references back to other deaths in Shakespeare for sure.
That is fascinating, and you know, we are all crafting our emails now that we will send.
Point 17.
Amazing. Can we turn our attention to Henry IV Part 1, and Benta, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us today. I was wondering if in Henry IV Part 1 you used pre-recorded fight scenes, and I was wondering if this play was the first time you used that, and how you were able to pull that off technically, and then if you changed anything after that, what did you do?
Sure, yeah, no, good questions. It wasn't the first time we'd used them. The first time we used them was in Taming of the Shrew, which was our second show, because we needed Katerina and Petruchio to have a fight, to have a physical altercation. And so we had our fight choreographers who were also both trained in Commedia dell'arte, which is a Italian style of very physical comedy that actually inspires a lot of Shakespeare's comedies, and especially those that are set in Italian settings. So we'd used stunt doubles before. Previously, they'd done them live rather than pre-recorded. And I think that's an important distinction. We moved on to pre-recorded fights, primarily because of lighting, because of the time that we were doing it and the time that the plays were happening. If we attempted to do it live, someone would have had to go out into the street at night with their very expensive laptop, stream from data, and hope that that connection was good enough, and then do the fight in darkness when the scene might have been a daytime scene. And so it just all became a bit like, there's too many variables here. And so we found that if you tried to screen share using Zoom, it stuck and it played at about 12 frames a second, and it was really jarring and interrupted. But if you played it as a virtual background, then it would actually play really cleanly at like 25 frames a second. So that raised a whole other set of issues. So first and most obvious, I've got a virtual background loaded here that I can use. This is just from Pericles, which was our last show. So I'm in the way. So I have to cover my camera like this in order to show you the virtual background. And then this could be a video that could play out, and that's great. But what I can't do is have sound associated with that. And all good fight scenes are made good by the sound. You will find that there's a theory in filmmaking that your visuals can be really bad and grainy, and it'll look like a choice if the sound is good. But if the sound is rubbish, they'll just be like, this is terrible. This is a rubbish thing. So we then had to get our sound designers to sync clashes and smashes and all the kind of sound effects with the video. And then I would play the video from one location and the sound designer would play the sound from another location, and we would both sync it to a line ending and hope that the two came close enough that it would read that the sound you were hearing were related to the images that you were seeing. So that was a big pain, but something that we just had to try and overcome. As we went on, that never got better. So we never got to just play a video with the sound together. Until we started using intermediary software called OBS for Christmas Carol. So in Christmas Carol, there was a video which was a mouse singing like in Muppets Christmas Carol. And we were able to actually play the video and audio from one source together, but only because the entire Zoom was then fed through this intermediary software, and loads of other intermediary processes had to be applied in order to make that doable. So it's still something that we are struggling with and that it is really annoying. Let's have a look. Did we use them again? Yes, we did use them again. We use them really regularly just because it was something that our audience responded well to. So we were in a unique position with The Show Must Go Online in that we were getting live, visceral audience feedback about what works and sometimes what doesn't work immediately. So we were getting the authentic Elizabethan player groundling experience of being heckled from the ground, whether positive or negative. And that allowed us to know whether something had juice or not. And people responded really positively to the use of stunt doubles and liked the fact that it was another side of the creative industries that were getting to showcase their art through this medium in a way that otherwise wouldn't be possible. And so we did decide to continue with them. The weaponry got more realistic. The costume items got more elaborate. The actors started, the stage fighting stunt doubles started to incorporate things like blood and stuff like that as we went on. And that was all really cool and interesting. But the format essentially stayed the same, which was that we would run at the screen and scream, "Wah!" and then those would cut off and we'd replace it with the two running into frame and doing a fight, separating out, and then the actors turning them back on and going, "Ah!" and chat, 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 chat. And probably the most obvious or the most extreme example of that is in Macbeth, where they have like 3 rounds of fight and there's chat in between. So they had to do that same process 3 times over and synchronize every one of those elements multiple times at once. So it grew in scale and it got more ambitious. Certainly the fight choreography, I think, did as well, because I think there's a healthy competition among fighters about the expression of their art. And I think they've probably seen some of the things that previous people had done and gone, well, I'm going to jump off a thing then. And it was like, cool, all right, yeah, carry on. We welcome you trying to top each other, because that's fun to watch and to see. Let's have a look.
So that there's fascinating kind of thinking there about how techniques developed over the course of doing the run. Lucas had an interesting question here about how you approach the chronology. So I think the way you frame it, right, is in the order in which they were believed to have been written.
That's
believed
correct.
is doing a lot of work in that
Believed
phrase,
by
right?
whom? Yes, absolutely, absolutely. By whom? So yeah, just so that it's out there and it's out loud, it is a matter of record. That we use the Wikipedia chronology because there are so many different scholars with so many different ideas, and if you pick one scholar's idea, you know you're going to hear from the other ones, right? But if you take Wikipedia, that's where the audience is going to find this 9 times out of 10 that aren't embedded in critique and dramaturgy and whatnot, right? So we're using the common law chronology, if you look at it that way. We did decide to make a couple of adjustments. So we had Henry VI Part 1, 2 and 3 in 1, 2, 3 order rather than going 2, 3, 1, which I think is how originally they were done, because we wanted to tell that saga as a kind of TV series in itself, in miniature, essentially. And we even created like previously on Henry VI kind of recaps for people that maybe hadn't watched the previous week. And so, yeah, we did make some adjustments, and then we did Tempest last, because it's so spectacular and so extraordinary as a piece to do, when in actual fact Henry VIII or All Is True is the last one. So we did make some slight adjustments to the chronology that we received, but it was nevertheless really illuminating to see them through that lens. And I think even if you disagree with the chronology, this empowers you to disagree with it, because you can look at what's being drawn down from one play into the next and go, actually, I think these two are swapped over because X, Y, Z. And that information is presented to you in a way that you can disagree with it actively if that's what you want to do. So I think even if you don't think that this is the chronology, it's a chronology. I think the reason it's so tricksy to do is because Shakespeare does include so many trailers in plays to the next one. So in Macbeth, it says about under him my genius is rebuked, as it is said Mark Antony's was by Caesar. Up next, Mark Antony and Cleopatra, right? And it's like, you could easily go, well, actually, Antony and Cleopatra must have been first, because then the audience understands the story that he's referring to because they've already seen it. And you can make that argument, or you can make the argument that it's a trailer. So ultimately, the discussions are arbitrary, but nevertheless fun and interesting to participate in, I suppose.
To some of the gender issues in some of Shakespeare's comedies, and we'll start first with As You Like It and then Twelfth Night. So Karen, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, Rob. Thank you so much for being here. This has been amazing so far. So the play that I studied was As You Like It. And since it's a play that is so central, gender is such a central role in this play, and the different aspects that the play kind of deals with, and certain gender norms that also play into the story. I was wondering what the casting process was kind of like for specifically a play of kind of this nature. Like when I remember when I first watched it, I was very, very pleasantly surprised to see that. And after doing research, I did check to make sure that the actors did identify this way. But I was very surprised to see that there were explicitly male characters that were played by female identifying actors. So I was wondering, was this were casting choices like this, were they just coincidental, or were they consciously done this way? If you could talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. So gender blind casting is our default, and that is something that we committed to from the beginning. The way we see it is that when the plays were done, men were actors and actors played all the parts. And now men and women are actors and actors play all the parts. So if it was gender blind in the sense that people were playing both genders when they were first performed, we can apply that same principle now, and it should make absolutely no difference. So in a way, it's a twist on the early modern classic in that way, but it's something that feels entirely defensible, especially with something like Shakespeare, where from the way that I describe it is all Shakespeare is argument. And so if you can make the argument, you can play the character. And that opens up casting in many dimensions. Not all, but many dimensions. As far as plays like this, we did have some gender conscious casting, absolutely. So there was the decision to keep Orlando and Rosalind in their normative genders. And that was largely because Rosalind is the Hamlet of the female roles in terms of it's the biggest role for women. And we wanted to make sure that we weren't going to be taking that away. And the idea was that over the whole piece, we wanted to have 50-50 or as close to it, gender representation. Now, obviously, that's not inclusive of non-binary people who we also did have involved, but we wanted to make sure that there was an equal representation of the two genders, if you like, and also inclusion of people outside of those two genders. So our touchstone was a non-binary performer, for instance. And when we are looking at gender explicitly in a play, I think getting to see the performance of gender prismatically can be of benefit. So to see the character perform a gender, and then to see an actor of a gender perform another gender, there's a difference in how those two things are executed that can allow for more layers and more textures, colours and flavours to be brought out of the text. Because Oliver just had to play Oliver, the person, rather than Oliver, the man, whereas Ganymede had to play, or Rosalind had to play Ganymede, the man. And so there's this performance of masculinity, which is slightly more overt, I suppose. And there are tricks that are deployed which throw up interesting dynamics, because it's the uncanny valley, right? The closer someone comes to achieving a true performance of a gender, the more your brain picks up on the exceptions, I suppose, and the more it becomes obvious that they're not that gender, in terms of Rosalind and Ganymede specifically. Whereas if you get someone like Candice, who's playing Oliver, just to be a person and not worry about gender, you forget about it and it's invisible, and it's not a thing that you care about or are conscious of immediately. So the performance of gender, or masculine and feminine, shall we say, traits, takes on an interesting dynamic in terms of when it is used and when it's not used. And then having a non-binary actor playing a character like Touchstone, who is a fool who lives outside of the norms of society anyway, and can flip certain expectations, I think adds another layer to that exploration. For me, it was very much, I'm trying to think how to describe it. It's like you set it up in the casting and you go, there's something interesting in that, and then you just let it go, right? So it's not that we meticulously were like, this is exactly what we want to say. It was more like, whatever happens will be interesting. And then it's up to the audience to take away from that what they take away from that. It's up to the actors how they want to incorporate those things into their performance or not. And we definitely found opportunities for that, but the extent to which that is done is still something that I want the actors to have agency over, because I want them to be comfortable in what they're doing. Again, as we said with Taming of the Shrew, don't want everyone saying this director did this to me. That's not a thing that we want to see people walking away from. So yeah, I'd say that was. So gender blind casting as a default, gender conscious exceptions, and this play in particular, because of the spread of gender that we were able to find in different areas, allowed us to see gender as a performance through multiple different lenses. And this is the play to do that with, I suppose.
And kind of following up on that, turning our thoughts to some of the same issues and Twelfth Night. Sophia, over to you.
Hello, thank you for speaking with us. There's so much to be said about gender in Twelfth Night as well. And I would like to ask also, what did you take into account when casting Twelfth Night? And in particular, why did you choose to cast and portray Festi as a woman? And how do you think this changes aspects of the play?
Sure. So we cast Caris because Caris is Welsh, a singer, and a multi-instrumentalist, and Feste needs to be really good at music. So it was the best person for the job, got the job. So the gender of Feste did not factor into our decision-making process at all. What I think is interesting, nevertheless, is what effect that can have for the audience. I think a Feste that is a woman, Feste plays into some of those clever servant tropes as well. Feste is the cleverest person in the play, and lives outside of the norms that this society is structured around. And I think there's questions about how intelligent women are interpreted. I think there's questions about whether women are allowed to hold authority within a patriarchy, and or how can they subvert those norms within a patriarchy. And I think it offered opportunities for a woman, for our Feste, still playing a man in terms of we didn't change the pronouns, but nevertheless your experience of watching it will be of a woman. How does that resonate with you in terms of how is Feste able to disrupt norms? Because the whole play of Twelfth Night is about misrule and about the inversion of the normal social order. And so I think it can have outcomes in that way, but I would always be careful about reading intention, I suppose, into that. In this case, we're lucky. I'm in the room. I can say, no, it didn't matter to us. But time and time again, I see with critique, people will state their interpretation of what an intention was as a fact. And it's like, we just can't do that. We just don't know most of the time. But that doesn't stop the interpretations that you have from being valid. So if you feel like it did affect those things, they're still interesting things to mine, certainly. I think in terms of Malvolio, there's something wonderful about having a woman play that in terms of highlighting the toxic masculinity or the patriarchy of that character in particular. The idea that this character is a servant who thinks that he's a master, I think is something that can be seen in starker contrast if there's a woman playing it. And I think that depends entirely on who the audience is and how, what cultural context they're watching it through and all the rest of it. But I think certainly that's something that could be taken away from it. I think the Puritanism and the repressed desires could have something to say about how women's desires are policed, and how the issues around the repression of desires by patriarchy in Malvolio as a person, as well as in society at large, can have bad results or can compress something into, or mutate something into a dangerous version of itself. That's self-inflicted for Malvolio. He's doing that to himself. But nevertheless, I'm no fan of Puritanism. So for me, there's strong links there between the idea of what happens to someone when you deny them their hormonal lived reality, their urges. And there's a big debate in Shakespeare over and over again and it was a philosophical question of that age, of the higher self and morality and philosophy and rationality, and then the lower self and the urges and the animality. And you get that wonderful Edmund speech in King Lear: "Thou nature art my goddess, to thy law my services abound." Right, the law of nature, red in tooth and claw. And so you've got that idea of urges versus higher ideas, and those are really seen in Malvolio as a character. Whether Malvolio being played by a woman allows us to examine masculinity more is a valid question to ask. Does it become more apparent because it's not someone who has that innately doing it? Does that make it shine brighter? It may not, but I think there's good questions to be asked around it for sure.
That's amazing. And so it's just so complex, right? These questions about gender blind, gender conscious, intensive actors versus experience of audience. And then this
can I just chip in? You've just given me an intrusive thought that I'd like to share, which is that there was gender conscious casting in this show, but it was Sebastian and Antonio, because we had missed the opportunity to look at the homoerotic themes in Merchant of Venice, because there was so much else that we had to deal with in that play. And so we'd missed the boat on that, and we wanted to make sure that we absolutely didn't miss the boat on it in this play. And there was a version of the cast which had a woman playing either or both of those roles. And I pushed back and I said, no, we must have two men playing these roles, because we need to show that, and we need to show that truth. And there were all kinds of complexities then in navigating, because Sebastian gets married to a woman at the end. The inference, therefore, is that he has a bi or pansexuality, and that there are certain tropes, unhelpful tropes about bisexual people that him abandoning Antonio can play into if you're not careful. And so there were whole discussions that were had around how can we represent Sebastian being in a male-to-male relationship earnestly without tacitly reinforcing damaging tropes and assumptions about bisexual people more broadly. So all of these things come up. I mean, it's really interesting that these groups seem to be like, the first group was so like technical and like performance and like action orientated, and all the questions in this group are so explorative and about the provocations and the challenges that just staging Shakespeare at all and making any decision about how you're going to stage it inevitably like blooms and blossoms out. And I would just encourage you to continue to explore them, because I think there are things that we absolutely encountered in the doing of it, but the doing of it is only the start of that broader conversation.
And so these questions come up with gender, they come up with sexuality, and then as we now turn to Othello, they come up with race in addition. So Joe, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming out. And this first question, it's not necessarily about Othello in particular, but it's sort of about Zoom and the space that you have to depend on um, for these sorts of plays. You know, you're dependent on the platform Zoom, the virtual space that you're in, but you're also dependent on whoever's Wi-Fi might be a little bit dicey that day, or you know, the actor's actual, you know, technical ability to do so. I personally had my own little snafu on Zoom in this class in particular. But my question was just, how did your approach to that evolve um, over the course of, you know, doing all these plays? And what did you tell the actors with how to deal with things like that? I know the actress playing Rodrigo and Brabantio, they had a little bit of a deal there in Othello itself. But how did your approach to Zoom and navigating a virtual space evolve over the course of doing these plays?
Sure. So there is a 35-minute YouTube video tutorial that was sent out to all the actors upon casting of these are the conventions we've discovered. This is how to best use them. Get familiar with them now because we won't have time in rehearsal. So it was like, this is your pre-work, is to understand how we are using Zoom and how we're interacting with Zoom. So that then if you have an aside, and that's marked in your text as an aside, you know that you want to be coming in close and you want to be doing a bit of whispering like this. And you pop back out and you get back into your normal state, right? And that was a convention that we had developed for an aside that then we could use whenever there was an aside in the future. So there's like an intense bit of front-loaded tutorial that it was like, this is how we're going to do it. When it comes to technical problems and limitations, one, we had swings, so that if anyone like dropped out or their internet connection was persistently causing an interruption in the flow of the story, we could deploy them and they would come in and they would read the lines for that character. We generally had 2 swings and they would take half of the characters each, and then they would jump in depending on whose internet messed up. The other thing that we talked to the actors about in terms of dealing with it was weather. So if you are working at the Globe in an outdoor space and a plane flies over, what can you do about that? Not much. If it starts raining, what can you do about that? Not much. If someone's internet cuts out, what can you do about that? Even less. So you have to deal with it in the same way that you have to deal with any unexpected instance that happens in live theatre. And the great thing about those situations were the ways in which the actors did respond earnestly and managed to get themselves out of those situations. But also seeing what am I trying to say? So they're trying to get themselves out of the situations. It's going very badly wrong for them, and it's proving therefore to the audience that it's happening in front of you and that it's not an edited, sanitized, perfect version of the experience. Part of theatre is the excitement that it's going to go wrong. And reminding the audience that yes, what you're seeing really is people beaming in from 5 different countries around the world simultaneously. That is pulling everything to breaking point, and sometimes there'll be a wobble. And what was lovely was that our audience took it in that spirit and saw it as a reinforcement that what they were watching was a simultaneous experience that they were enjoying at the same time as it was being given, rather than something that was pre-recorded. And so I think we never allowed ourselves to freak out about internet, even when it was at its worst. It was something that would add something to the sense of spontaneity of the show, rather than something that would take away. It was unfortunate, you know, because there was one character. There was one character in one of the plays who came out and he had one big speech at the start and his internet died and he missed it, and that was him. So he never got on stage. Stuff like that does happen, but it's always good.
We've got a couple good questions that we can come back to momentarily, but I do want to toss over to Albert to think a little bit about All's Well That Ends Well.
Of course, yeah.
Hi Rob, I'm Albert, and thank you so much for coming to our class. So I'm reading All's Well That Ends Well right now, and my first impression was that this play is one that relies much more on like language and dialogue and chemistry between actors, rather than like big visual scenes or action scenes. And I was just wondering like if there was a different approach to like plays that were much more conversation based than the plays that were like action based. And
Yes.
also just like because Oswald and Enzo isn't like it's one of the lesser known plays, and was there a different approach to the lesser known plays versus the more famous plays?
Yes, definitely. I think you've unwrapped so many useful little nuggets there at once. I'm going to try and hit them all. Remind me if I don't. Yes, it's one of the lesser known plays, which means that we can push it less far in the time that we have. We have approximately 2.5 days of rehearsal. And when it's Romeo and Juliet and everyone's seen it a million times and they know exactly what the beats are, we can get creative with like epic camera work and fights and costume and all this kind of stuff, right? Because people have got the mental bandwidth to be able to do so. With an Allswell, which is A, an obscure play, and B, a language play, as you've said. Love's Labour's Lost is another great example of a language play, right? It's about what's being said and by whom and why, rather than necessarily what's happening. I think that's a great observation. But with those, yes, we just have to spend more physical time unpacking that and understanding and getting the sense, and then wrestling with how we convey that sense to the audience. The good thing is that dramaturgically the plays are designed so that if you do that, they work, rather than needing the extra stuff that the action plays kind of have in there. You know, the play has been written to not require those big set pieces for whatever reason. And, you know, whether that's because it was in an indoor show as opposed to an outdoor show, and so there was less of a need for spectacle. There was a more educated audience that were more interested in these kind of linguistic, what's the word, like repartee, I suppose. I think all of that stuff starts to inform why the plays were written the way that they were. But ultimately, with our raison d'etre of trying to serve the dramatic intention of the piece, we definitely lent into that by making explicit the rhetorical techniques and devices that were being used, and using that as a route into what the characters were being motivated by and how the dynamics between them start to fluctuate. So, for instance, as a teaching tool, I use Helena's "Here on my knees before high heaven and you," and next to all that, "I love your son," that speech. I use that as a speech to teach rhetoric, and specifically the arguments or appeals to logic, emotion, and authority. And through that speech, and every actor will interpret it slightly differently, and that's valid. But if you interpret that speech through those three types of appeal, you can start to activate what is a massive chunk of text and instead make it feel more dynamic and more dialogic. Even though the Duchess isn't responding verbally, she may be providing resistance that motivates a change of tactic. So, which is a very actory way of looking at text. Actioning text and playing tactics, all this kind of stuff is how actors tend to think of things. So if you look at it and you're changing from logic to emotion, or from logic to authority, and you're making a lot of changes very quickly, it's almost like, is this going to work? No. Is this going to work? No. Is it, this is working. I'm going to stay on this. I'm staying on this. Oh no, it's starting to not work. I better change, right? And so you've got this idea of the character being uncertain of what the other person is going to respond best to, and therefore throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks in a way, but also then getting hooks in and seeing when little things do start to affect them. I'm going to explore that further, or I'm going to push further in that direction, because that's what's working. I think what's nice about that is that it externalizes. Actors can also be very internal and very like me and my feelings and my emotions and my psychology and my character. And sometimes it's actually about you. It's about the person I'm speaking to. What do I want to get from you, and how can I convince you to give it to me? And so I think we spent a lot more time looking at those forms of argument, because this play is a very argumentative play. It's one of the problem plays, so it has a bed trick in it, which is essentially a rape. It's non-consensual sex without people knowing what's going on. It's a deception, and that's a real problem. But I think what's nice about the problem plays, as they're sometimes known, is that they are there to provoke, and they are there to start discussion, and they are there for an audience to engage with actively. It is not for us to fix it for you and to give you a sanitized experience, as the Victorians tried to do. They are there for us to put it in front of you and go, this is being played like a happy ending. I'm not sure how happy I am about that ending. And I think that's a valid thing. And I think that's something that sometimes in the critique of work, it can be missed because the person that is critiquing it wants a certain version, has a headcanon of what they think should be shown to them. And if it diverges from that, rather than that being an interesting release of energy, it's a criticism that it hasn't done the job properly, as it were, or hasn't got it right. And I think that's a pitfall that we can sometimes fall into. But it's something that with all of our problem plays, we try to release the energy in the provocation and ask the question of the audience rather than give them the answer. And I think All's Well in a language play is a really good opportunity to ask audience useful questions because they present both sides of every argument so well that you can't help but engage and go, well, actually, I kind of see, but no, but then that person. And then we as an audience are leaning forward in our seat rather than leaning back. And that's something that we try and kind of hold on to for grim death when we're producing these in the little time that we have, for sure.
That's so fascinating, and especially kind of when you take that approach to acknowledging and allowing the problematic natures of the text to sort of be, that really speaks to kind of the community of trust that the Show Must Go Online built, because that kind of needs to be there in place. People need to feel like we're all coming to this with good intentions, and we're all kind of here to have a good conversation. And in a kind of digital space, conversations can take different directions that you didn't expect. So I think it's a testament to be able to kind of wrestle with those problems by creating the space in which this year-long project was managed.
I think there's something in the introduction, the guest introductions as well, that helped to facilitate the expectation that that's what we were going to be doing, because that academic did not participate in any of our rehearsals and often brought to the table interpretations of the text which completely differed from those that we used to actually mount the production. And so I think by having immediately that prismatic plurality of interpretations opened up for you at the start of the piece gives you more agency as a recipient of the drama to have those conversations or to ask those questions. And obviously the fact that we have a Q&A, you can literally ask us the question as well, which I suppose is a difference from maybe trad theatre, where it's like a finished product.
Fascinating to think about the liveness of the event. If we turn to Antony and Cleopatra, I know Aria's been thinking about kind of the filmic qualities of the event, which then kind of come into interesting relationships. So Aria, over to you.
Yeah, hi Rob. First of all, it's so great to meet you. Yeah, and I just really want to thank you for all the effort that you've put into these stagings that we're getting to watch now. And yeah, Professor Olson was just kind of talking about this, but my question was sort of, yeah, like after watching your staging of Antony and Cleopatra, I kind of felt like it evoked more of a filmic style than a traditional theatrical style. And I'm a huge cinephile. I love films. Not to say I don't love theater, but I'm just saying I feel like maybe that had an effect on how much I appreciated the play and your staging of it. And in particular, you included these brilliant time lapses before every scene, which set the geography very clear, which especially in a play like Antony and Cleopatra, where there's so much oscillation between Rome and Egypt, it's like, it was really confusing when I was reading the play, Shakespeare's version. So I thought the time lapses were very helpful. And even the music you were playing behind each of them, it just like the intensity was more like a film score than like something from the Great American Playbook. So I feel like yeah, I'd just like to hear a little bit about where the idea for the time lapses came from, and also I guess like the inherent proximity of the camera angle for Zoom and like films, that's in common, right? You're close up to the facial expressions of the actors, and that's something that we kind of miss out on in the stage. So I was just wondering, when you were directing and staging this virtual version, how did you take into consideration this sort of blend of film, stage, and Zoom?
Answer is 100%. This is a really exciting question because it's like landed on a key part of the approach, which is that I too am a cinephile. And if I was to describe my approach, I have the movie of it in my head, and then we do the stage adaptation of the movie. So that, and one of the things that we always said to the actors at the start of every process was we have Hollywood blockbuster ideas and a Poundland or dollar store budget. So we're never going to get there. We're never going to get there. But in the aspiration to get there, we will close in on something that's more exciting, more immediate than otherwise. In terms of just the nuts and bolts of why time lapse, how did it get done in that way? Captain America Civil War has these establishing shots with this massive text that goes, Vienna, bang, here we are, right? And that was the inspiration for them, because this play, as he rightly pointed out, jumps all over the place and it's super disorientating. So we wanted to give the audience a fighting chance of knowing what was happening when. So usually I would read out the stage directions. Now, this was the problem that led us to that solution. And that was, I am a white man and the show was an all global majority cast. So I have done some progressive portrayal training, which talks about the importance of who is framing the story, whose perspective are we watching it through. So if I, as a white man, I'm reading you the stage directions and reminding you of my presence, that's going to be really problematic and undermining of the whole point of doing it in the way that we did it. Because I couldn't read them out loud, we needed a different device. So we talked about the idea of potentially one of the characters doing it and it being a bit like Jack Bauer and he's kind of like previously on 24, that kind of thing. Like we could have had characters taking ownership of territories was one thing that we talked about. But then we talked about the idea of, we've been putting these in to make them performed readings so that we are reminded that what you are watching is not a show. And then we were like, we are trying so hard in everything else to make this the showiest show that a show can be, and then excusing ourselves to the audience by using this device, right? So what if instead of using it to undercut ourselves and to try and reset expectations, we use it to amplify and make it more grand, because that's what this play is all about. The scale, the spectacle, it's an epic in every sense of the word, the length, my God. So it's a beast, right? So we wanted to give that sense of scale, essentially. And out of the problem, which was we don't want a white guy narrating this all global majority cast, came the solution, which was let's make it cinematic, let's make it bigger than, and give it that sense of scale and welly. And we did that through, as you say, through all of the different tools that we had available. We mentioned in the previous session, I'm no fan of subtlety. We try and make all the choices as clear as possible to the audience so that you can get it first time. And differentiating the music, the sound beds between Rome and Egypt is just another easy way to be like, you're somewhere else, you're somewhere else, you're somewhere else. So yeah, definitely a lot did go into that particular process and at that particular point in the progression of the pieces as well.
So fascinating. From a very long play to a very short play, we can turn to Macbeth. And Arba, over to you.
First of all, this has been a very eye-opening experience, and I just have so many questions, but I have to pick just one. So I'm going to go with asking about the idea of the opportunity for the audience to see the characters more up close throughout the entire play. I feel like they're in a theater, like we have a lot more detachment from the characters, no matter how close to the stage you are. There's always like there's the height and just detachment. And in the case of Macbeth, I found that in addition to the asides that were scripted and just the opportunity to see them up close, like a question popped up in my head about whether it was fair to be given so much opportunity, like for the characters to be given so much opportunity to express their true self and to have more opportunity to get sympathy from the audience, especially for Macbeth, who commits a lot of heinous crimes.
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. There's always that dynamic of the public and the private in a Shakespeare play, and the characters will have a public persona and then a private persona that they will share with the audience but won't share with other people that are on stage. And Zoom really allowed us to amplify that. So in something like Julius Caesar as well, when there's conspiracy, we were able to genuinely whisper the words so that we weren't overheard, and we can create that sense of claustrophobia and pressure so much more effectively in this medium than we can in another. Every audience member has a front row seat. You know, the idea that you can see the whites of their eyes is one of those things that gets kind of repeated. And that's absolutely true of this medium. The audience has agency in terms of if a character is speaking, they can look at another character's reaction and response to that, and they can see, oh, how does Warwick feel about this or whatever. So you're on a bit of a choose your own adventure in that way because of the flatness of the medium. I think in terms of getting more emotional response from their relationships to the audience, I think I'm so glad that it feels that way, is the way that I'll put it, because I know that the actors are speaking to a little black dot, a lifeless black dot of nothing, right? And they have no one to speak to, and they are as divorced from the audience as it's possible to be, thousands of miles away, right? So the gulf that they are having to reach to span is epic. Conversely, back to film, I have a close-up, especially if no one else is on stage and I'm doing a soliloquy. I have a cinematic close-up where my head, depending on the device that you're watching it on, may be bigger than it is in real life. So every slight tick and subtlety and anything, emotional journey, flicker in the eyes, is going to read. And that gives me an incredibly rich set of tools to use to explain myself to you, if we look at it that way, for soliloquies. You know, I talk about soliloquies: exclaim, explore, and act. I have a problem. Oh, what am I going to do about the problem? Philosophy. Yeah, that's what I'll do. That's basically the structure of all soliloquies, right? So we can have that conversation one-sidedly with the audience, but a lot of the work that we did was to productively heckle our characters. So I would often say, imagine an audience member saying, if it were done when 'tis done, then to well it were done quickly. If what were done quickly, if the assassination could trammel up the car, oh, I see, you're right. And we would turn it into a dialogue and a conversation as a way to break up the text and give people that sense that they were, even though they were talking to a dot, still relating with somebody that might have opinions or disagreements with them that they then had to overcome with the arguments that they're making. Again, all Shakespeare's argument, a kind of core part of the way that we approached it, in order to make sure that when you as an audience are watching it, you feel engaged with, rather than, I have an essay here on doing assassination or not. You know, it's not that. It's a conversation.
Can we turn our thinking to The Winter's Tale and toss over to you, Allie?
Hi, thank you again for coming. So in The Winter's Tale, I'm looking a lot at how the tragedy in the first half and then the comedy in the second half of the play are kind of shown a lot through the use of lighting in your production, and I guess the use of different props and clothing. So I was just wondering whose idea was to establish these different like atmospheres and lighting themes in the two parts, and how these conversations developed.
Sure, yeah. So I am really reticent to take credit for anything where many directors would do the opposite. And I think that's probably why I'm reticent. However, I would say that everything that we do goes through this R&D process, which I previously mentioned, where we have all of the team involved. And one of our actors once described it, which is a bit macho. It's not like this. Tonally, this is not the best metaphor, but it kind of gives you the idea. But as an octagon where all the ideas come to fight it out and the best idea wins. And by that, it means that it's not about individual ownership of whose idea was what. It's about getting to the best version of it and delivering that. So I definitely, one thing that I can say, which I think feeds nicely into this, is that Shakespeare uses contrast to create everything. All the drama in Shakespeare is contrast. And the word contrast is my one commandment. And that's the sign that I keep above the door. That's the thing I always remind myself of. And Winter's Tale is a wonderful example of contrast, because the two places, two time periods, because bear in mind one's 16 years later, really show you a really strong contrast. And so the question became, how can we maximize the forms of contrast in the piece? Lighting was one example. So we had stark, dark, laptop illuminated Sicilia. So the light was cold, indifferent, and it gave you the sense of, if you strayed too far from the camera, you could end up in darkness. And that's a really nice idea of what is a safe space and what is not. The idea that, you know, if you're going to walk down an unlit street, that feels more dangerous than walking down a lit street. And the idea that you've got this pool of light that you're safe within, but that around you could be anything, I think immediately is unsettling psychologically for us. And I think it gives us the sense of unsettlingness about Sicilia, and the fact that Leontes obviously is the king, is the head of that state, and it's that kind of trickle down effect of what happens to him as a seismic impact on what happens in the landscape as a whole. We decided that we wanted Sicilia to be more Icelandic, more Nordic. You know, there's like ice caves and aurora and things of that nature going on there, because they have these months and months of darkness, and that made it a possibility to have daytime scenes that were still dark. And it gives you more contrast, this rocky, icy, savage wilderness, from the pastoral ideal and the warm, fluffy, open, breezy kind of Bohemia. That was followed through in the other design choices, in terms of, we asked people to have like straight lines and sharp angles in their backgrounds when they were in Sicilia, and then like organics and a sense of expansiveness and openness to what was going on in Bohemia. There were many flowers in Bohemia, because flowers are springtime, right? So you've got winter and spring, and the fact that Perdita, coming of age and coming into her own agency, is a coming of spring in itself. And obviously she gives away flowers. She's like the head of this springtime festival, you know, the sheep shearing, all that kind of stuff. So a lot of this stuff is implicitly embroidered into the text, and we just tried to explicitize it with the production design, and just make it more unmissable, I suppose. I've seen productions that try to homogenize, that try to reduce the distance between the ideas, and I think that that's always a mistake, because Shakespeare's #1 favorite literary device is antithesis, where we take two opposites and we smash them together like in a particle accelerator, and we release all the energy of these opposing concepts. Right? And it's something he uses constantly. And this is a structural antithesis. It's darkness and light. And so we wanted to just make that as obvious and apparent. One thing that I would say was never a guiding principle of Show Must Go Online was subtlety. And that can be for better or worse, but it was always about, because you as an audience are already doing so much work to interpret Zoom as a medium, we wanted to give you as much help with everything else as possible, so that things would read. I think especially because when people are in their bedrooms, it can be hard to extrapolate from that as an audience what cues I'm supposed to be receiving, what's deliberate and what's incidental. And so if we could make things really deliberate and clearly deliberate, it would allow you to piece out our imperfections with your thoughts.
In this group, we've got so many plays coming from the second half of Shakespeare's career, and so kind of continuing on here, we can think about Henry VIII, and Josh, over to you.
Oh wow, yeah. Just again, like, so great how they were able to join us around for all this, and again, like, I just really enjoyed your company's production of Henry VIII, and it's just such a niche aspect of history that I just had such a great time exploring. And in your production, the two things that really stood out to me were, first, just your overall humanization of Henry VIII, like this huge mythical figure in English history, and then your just brilliant use of candlelight to show the rises and falls of the characters and their relative statuses. And just wondering if you could touch on either or both of those a little bit, and what inspired your approach to those, like, and in particular, like, if you used the candlelight like other plays, like, that was just blew my mind, like how clever that was, really.
Thanks so much. So we did use it deliberately and consciously with this production, because this production would have been performed at Blackfriars, which is the inside space. Originally performed. It was then performed at the Globe, and it burned the Globe down. So the idea of fire, playing with fire, became the kind of sign above the door for the play. And the idea that you would have live flame is something that's really exciting. I think about this play. So pleased that you picked up on the rise and falls in status being like punctuated by the candles being blown out. That was something that we started in Macbeth, and then we thought that we could continue consciously in Henry VIII. So the witches blew out a candle anytime somebody died. And so with our audience having experienced that and seen that and being kind of trained to understand the semiotics of that, the idea that people were doing it to themselves, I thought was particularly interesting in this play. Because everyone is gracious in defeat in this play. And it's one of the weird things about it. There's all this skullduggery and backstabbing and like politicking and vying for power. And then as soon as you've gone, and I've reached the pinnacle of my ascent, and then the rug's been pulled out of me. Oh, well, it was a lovely time. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. And now I'm going to go to prison for the rest of my life. It's such a weird play, this one. And so just finding, why do the characters decide to take their descent? Because there are so many plays in which characters don't, that it seemed remarkable and a sore thumb to me that in this one, everyone was gracious in defeat. And the blowing out of your own candle was a kind of way of trying to show a little bit of that grace. Whereas in Macbeth, everyone goes down fighting and no one wants to die, right? And it might be that these characters don't die necessarily. That could be one of the reasons why. But I think the subversion of the myth of Henry VIII, to me, is part of the embroidery of the text. I think the text is there to do that in some way. I don't think we took it and flipped it and did that with it. I think that's what's there. And I think that's because, a lot of people will look at the plays and look at what's different about them and blame it on the co-writer. So people will be like, oh, well, this was a collaboration with Fletcher. So if anything's weird, it's Fletcher's fault and just whatever, right? But we always approached it as in what's done is done deliberately. And even if it's done collaboratively, it's done for a purpose. And what was weird about this play and what stood out about this play was the meticulousness and the exhaustiveness of the stage directions. Shakespeare uses stage directions almost nowhere else to the level of detail that he does in this play. And it seems to me that the reason that they're so meticulous, whether they were written by Fletcher or not, I don't care. Shakespeare could have said, don't put that in, but he didn't. Right? So the reason that they're so meticulous is because he's striving for a historical veracity. He's trying to show this is exactly how it happened. There are parts of Catherine's speech in the trial that are drawn almost verbatim from what she actually said. So he's striving in the public scenes for a historical veracity. This is what you knew happened, right? This is what actually happened. And then in the private scenes, you're seeing something completely different. And we see Henry almost only in private scenes. Very little that he says is in the public scenes compared to the private ones. And all of those are imagined, but they're all real and human. And we approach Lachlan, who played Henry, because he's a historian in real life, but also because he's one of the most naturalistic speakers of verse that we've encountered over the whole thing. He just sounds like he's talking, right? And we wanted to get that sense that Henry was a real person because he was. And I think part of the reason of staging these pageants with umpteen people coming on stage in very specific orders, right, and in very specific etiquettes and protocols, was to show you that power is theatrical. Power is made up. It is costumes, it is props, and it is stage management. And that's all it is. And that's the same for kings, and it's the same for actors. And what they're doing when they do these things is theatre. And I think so much of the excitement for me of doing the canon is seeing how Shakespeare was educating his audience on the theatre of politics and the theatre of power, and showing them through a piece like this that there is no functional difference between the actors on this stage and the actual people playing those roles in Westminster. There's no difference. It's exactly the same. And if that's true, what else is true? And that's why the subtitle or the alternate title, All is True, for me in this play is extraordinarily provocative, because it's giving you the idea of, again, weirdly, you've got Catholics, Protestants, Puritans, and they all get a champion in the play, and they all get someone who sounds reasonable and does a nice thing, right? So there's no Richard III in this play that's like, I'm the Puritan and I'm the bad guy, right? Nobody's doing that in this play. And the idea that Shakespeare was kind of trying to call for a religious pluralism or a religious tolerance, maybe, is something that you could infer from that. I think it's a head scratcher, but it's a deliberate head scratcher. And I think part of that is about you as an audience, again, having to examine what you're being confronted with actively.
This is a remarkable segue into our next play. The thing about the people who love Cymbeline is that they really love Cymbeline. So Sarah, over to you.
Hi, yes, I am one of those people who really love Cymbeline. Yeah, as everyone said, thank you so much for coming. It's been really great to kind of hear a little bit more about the background of these. I'm going to ask a question that wasn't actually the question I was planning on asking, but I think might be more interesting. I'm kind of exploring politics in Cymbeline, especially because it was staged the day after the American election. And in the introduction to the play, Sawyer Kemp talked a little bit about how it was written at a time where England was becoming an empire in its own right. And the play is about, England as part of the Roman Empire. So I was wondering a little bit about how kind of that imperial structure worked its way into the staging, and if there was any kind of influence with the, American Empire, with the, with the election, everything, and I guess how nationalism and imperialism kind of played into your staging of Cymbeline.
Sure. Okay. I hope this is not a disappointing answer, but Cymbeline has a fairy tale quality to it. It has a lot of fairy tale tropes in it, and the structure of it is broadly fairy tale-esque. It's a part of Britain where there's no real known history. I think Cymbeline gets like 3 sentences in Holinshed's Chronicles, and Shakespeare's extrapolated the whole rest of the thing, right? Whereas something like King Lear or Macbeth, there's much more like historical information that it's based on. This, not so. It's also a greatest hits of Shakespeare's tropes. And we are also winding up our progression through the canon, right? So it's also a time where, fortunately, we're not there, but we were facing 4 more years of Trump. Escapism was the guiding light for this production, both internally and externally. We wanted to provide an oasis of escape that was still functional. I believe escapism has a massive and important role to play in our lives, because it shows us that other worlds are possible. And I think that should never be underestimated. But our intention was absolutely to give people, for the show as a whole, an escapist fairy tale that was still dark and provocative where it's dark and provocative, because there's a hell of a lot of toxic masculinity in Cloten, and you've got crazy issues going on with Yakimo, and in like invading someone's personal space without their consent or knowledge, and there's like really dark stuff going on there, and we wanted the dark stuff to feel dark. If you look at that scene with Yakimo, we deliberately had multi-camera in that, and it was edited almost like a scene on TV. But the idea of it was that you are in the box with him, which is not achievable on stage. So you are invading that space with him, and you are a voyeur. You're not supposed to be there either. We then had a camera that was set up from her perspective, so that you could actually put yourself in the place of that person and see what it's like to have a guy creeping around and talking about you while you're not aware. And that's horrible, gross. And then we had that wide shot, that kind of paranormal activity shot, as we called it, which shows you his freedom within this space, and the fact that he's occupying it, taking it up, and it's and the wrongness of that and the unsettlingness of that, the horror movie quality of that, was something that we really wanted to get across. Similarly, Jupiter descends on an eagle, firing bolts of lightning to electrocute ghosts, almost like it's Ghostbusters, and these things are happening in the same play. So there's extraordinary journeys all the way through it. And while we absolutely wanted to play, I guess what I'm saying is we tried to play the moment earnestly, and then play the next moment earnestly, and let the whole be greater than the sum of its parts for itself. Now, our Jupiter was a black woman flying in on a bald eagle to save a global majority posthumous from detention and death row. So can you politicize that? Yes, quite easily. We could have chosen a different eagle. We didn't. We could have cast Jupiter a different way. We didn't, right? These things have an effect and they have an impact, absolutely. And if there was one thing that I think is provocative about that, it's that the Roman Empire and the American Empire, as you said, eagles have long been associated with fascism. And because Jupiter in this, and that starts with the Roman Empire, Jupiter in this is meant to be a benevolent force, is meant to be a force for good. So we had to like play that, and we had to get it as far down that road as we could take it. And so you can look at it as an optimistic vision of America in that way, if you like. But you can't separate America from imperialism, right? The idea of the great democratic experiment was like, it was one step when that happened. The Declaration of Independence was one step. It was a more democratic form of fascism, but it's still fascism. And we still have those steps to go even now, and we're probably going to continue to have to keep stepping forever, because that's how progress works, and that's a good thing. I think in terms of just let me just check my notes briefly, because there's something else I want to talk about with this. Oh yeah, that was it. It was the fact that Britain wins the war and then continues to give tribute to the Romans anyway. That is just this baffling, like, now we know that we're superior, we're happy to stay part of the collective, which from a Brexit perspective in England is really provocative and is really like charged. We didn't explicitly try to explore that, but you get it for free anyway, just from the parallel circumstances. But I think that there's something really weird about that dramaturgically in the play that is absolutely valid to explore from a perspective of how do we interpret that choice of Cymbeline to continue to give a tribute after he's won his independence. That's a weird decision. And so what was Shakespeare trying to say, I guess, what was the moral of that story is definitely a road that you could travel down for sure.
That's great. And our revels are not yet ended, because we turn now to the Tempest. Jesse, can we toss over to you?
All right. Hey, Rob. Thanks
Hi.
again for joining us today. And yeah, I had the privilege of watching your very last production, The Tempest. And, after reading the play for the first time, I was like, wow, Shakespeare's really going over the top with these special effects. And then I was completely blown away with your production, from the animations to the music to the fancy Zoom filters and lots of fire too. Like, I was completely amazed by the Show Must Go Online's production of The Tempest. So my question, with such complex stage directions, with such complex effects, like where did you even begin to approach all the directions that Shakespeare put? And with this being your final production of The Show Must Go Online, like how far along had your video and Zoom knowledge come? And lastly, how does your Zoom environment interpretation compare to a live in-person theatrical interpretation of The Tempest?
Okay, sure. So yeah, great questions. We flipped it. So in the chronology, Henry VIII came last. And we flipped it to do Tempest last, because it's a spectacular in all the ways that you're talking about. And it was the best way for us to go out. It's also a play, weirdly, one of only 2 plays, I believe, maybe 3, that observe the Aristotelian unities. So the idea that it happens in the same place at the same time in chronological order and all that kind of stuff. It's a play that required us to have done the chronology in order to do successfully. And I think that was one of the massive benefits of doing the chronology, was that Shakespeare's ambition as a dramatist went on an arc that we were able to follow. If you take it back to the beginning, the most challenging thing about Two Gentlemen of Verona was passing a letter and a dog. And then in this, we've got fire and shipwrecks and all the rest of it, right? And as I said, Henry VIII burned down the Globe Theatre by setting cannons off. So we know that Shakespeare was a lover of spectacle. We know that he was creating the blockbusters of his age. And so it's fair to me for us to look to blockbusters of our age to look to how we can bring that to life most efficiently and most effectively. Unfortunately for us, our technological limits, because of budget and because of software interfaces and all the rest of it, is around about 1950s, 1960s era. So that's the place that we can like get to with our effects. So when there's the shipwreck on Star Trek, that what they would do is get the actors to just stagger about and they'd wave the camera side to side. So that's exactly what we did for the shipwreck. We got the actors to tip their cameras like this and to stagger about in them like that. And then you get the idea that I'm on a ship that's at sea and everything's unstable, right? So we took that from 1960s Star Trek because that's doable for us. What we could add to that, what we're looking to be able to add to that, was a snap cam filter, was this rain filter that was on the screen in front of the actors, so that then you got that Jason Bourne docu style, like the elements are actually affecting the lens. So it's not Eye of God, it's like actual, like an on the ground kind of Blair Witch Project type perspective. We were fortunate that we had sound design, and that did a lot of the work for us throughout. There's loads of atmospheres, but there's also very cinematic use of score. So like even when there's like emotional beats, we're lifting those with moments of score, or we're trying to anyway. And so it was a culmination, a deliberate culmination of all of the techniques that we had developed over the whole 36 or 35 preceding shows. And when we came to it, we called it the kitchen sink production, because we were throwing everything at it. We wanted to make sure that there was some evidence of every single technique that we'd developed in the show. Fortunately, it really lends itself to that. It's a maximalist show. And we had a guy who was a sleight of hand magician in the cast. We had Betsy, who's an amazing non-binary fire artist playing Ariel, and actually managed to get their troupe together to do the harpy, right? And it's just like, oh my God, amazing. And so we were very lucky as well at that point that we'd attracted a level of talent to the group that were capable of pulling it off. So as much as our, special effects, whatever, got to a certain level, that show went beyond, because there were people with real life, practical, tangible, special skills that not only were they really good at Shakespeare, which is hard, right? They were also really good at close-up magic and like live fire spinning, right? Both really hard. So it was a kind of zenith. And then, you've got our Prospero, who is like a veteran of the Toronto, the Stratford Festival in Toronto, in Canada, playing Prospero. And he got his start as a prop maker. So his staff is like Hollywood movie quality staff, because he's like got that special skill. So I think what it says even more, is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and that we have always, as the show must go online, relied on the wisdom of crowds. We have always, we mentioned it in a previous session, that was like, the octagon where all the ideas come to fight it out, and the best idea wins, regardless of where it comes from. So I will give people a direction, by which I mean a literal trajectory. I want this moment to be something like this, and we have workshopped in our R&D a version of how we can do it. And then the actor goes, my space doesn't work that way, or my laptop can't move in that way, or this or that, or actually I've got this thing over here. And we enter a dialogue where we greenhouse. So this is something that we nicked from innovation thinking, which is greenhousing and shithousing. So greenhousing is the idea that we take the seed of an idea and we pour water on it and we radiate sunshine on it, and the idea grows up and it grows little branches that go off in different directions. And maybe the perfect version of the idea is a leaf somewhere over on this branch, but we wouldn't have got there if we hadn't yes-anded and nurtured and given that idea the love and support that it needed. Shithousing is where you take the seed and you put it on the concrete, and you take a shovel and you smash it relentlessly on the floor by saying, no, that's stupid and wrong, I don't like it, right? So that was part of our ethos, that I think came through in that production kind of as much as, if not more than any other, purely because we were relying on experts to be the best at what they can do and what they can bring, in a way that I, as a director, can't. I could have had a go, but I can't choreograph a fire troop to make a harpy, right? I just have to trust that Betsy has that capability within themselves, and they did spectacularly. And we were the beneficiaries of that. You know?
Amazing. And as we turn now to our final play, Pericles, which is really recent, can we toss over to Justin, please?
Yeah, I thought it was really amazing how you're able to like get these shows to come to life like on a Zoom stage. Um, I I think a few things were really interesting to me. I thought your inclusion of like a BSL interpreter was very I guess accessible minded, and um it was like engaging to watch. I guess uh the signing, like the vigorous expressions of the interpreter to go alongside the play. Um and also what else? I thought Gower was a very interesting figure with all the props and um crazy fluid wavy mystical motions that they did. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on those, and also, I guess maybe if there are any lessons with this moral of like resilience and virtue um, handed down by Pericles. Are there any takeaways here, or especially prominent messages to us in these times?
Nice, nice. A good number of questions there. I'll try and hit them all. Remind me if I don't. First off, BSL, amazing. Actually, first off, I didn't direct Pericles. Marianne Grace did, who was one of our alumni who played Macbeth in our all-female and non-binary production Macbeth. As we completed the folio, it was my ambition when we got into it that I would do the first folio, and Pericles stands outside of that. And I'm now being able to do that. I'm very fortunate to be able to say that I have. One thing that I was aware of, which we've already kind of started to cover in Othello and other places, is the fact that I am a cis-het white man. And that means that I have one very narrow and very limited perspective. And we were reckoning with that throughout to the extent that we could on our very fast production line. But for instance, with the casting of Othello, we had an academic called David Sterling Brown, who I consulted with on the race-conscious casting of that play. And that was the most race-conscious casting that we did. And I knew that I was not in a position to be able to make those decisions independently and to represent best interests by doing so. And so once we finished the canon, I stepped back into the role of artistic director rather than director. And the priority was to get people from underrepresented backgrounds of all stripes into the director's chair. And that's either people that don't have loads of experience or people that normally don't get those opportunities. Maz did exactly what I did. She put a tweet and said, I think 3 weeks before we finished, was like, so if TSM Joe isn't doing Pericles, should I just do it? And I was like, I respect that. I see you. I can see the parallel in what you're doing there. Let's do this. So it became the start of a transformation of TSMGO into a franchise model. McDonald's is an imperfect metaphor, but it gives you the idea that we have created a system and a way of working and a visual grammar and a way of dealing with Zoom that directors can utilize and be supported in their exploration of a text and a piece with the benefit of an established brand and an established audience. And we can pass all that set of tools on to someone else and they can run with it because we've explored every corner of it and we broadly know where we're at with it. So then each director is going to bring their own things. Maz was really keen on getting BSL into the show. And so that shorthand, that's why we did it, because Maz wanted to do it and it was a good idea. Maz has mentioned on Twitter some of the reasons why, the physical expressiveness of it and all the rest of it, and just BSL as an extraordinary language. We also shot for ASL, but we couldn't find an interpreter to do it because ASL interpreters tend to work in pairs and they tend to take more breaks and time off. Jan is an anomaly in that she did the entire show and every single character uninterrupted and then did the Q&A and is like an absolute legend. And what she was capable of and what she pulled off there is genuinely extraordinary. And I think the ease with which the apparent ease with which she pulled it off can betray a lie, which is that it's therefore easy, and it's really not. She had to learn the whole play, translate the whole play, memorize the translation of the whole play, and then perform it, not just do it, but perform it and characterize it. Being sympathetic to what she was receiving in the moment from the actors that were then taking those roles on. She's trying to siphon them. It's absolutely unbelievable. It's mind-blowing what processes were at play in order to pull that off. But that was Maz's ambition. And that was born out of the kind of shared value, if you like, of trying to maximize accessibility. And it's something we'd never been able to do before. And it's something that we were able, thankfully, to do this time. And we had subtitles as well, so that our American people or international people that didn't know BSL would still be able to follow along with it live and in the moment, rather than having to wait for the recording. So that's BSL. Gower, fascinating character, definitely. What to say about Gower, other than the fact that Murph just nailed it? So Murph was a hard of hearing actor. And so we had to have, so again, back to that access needs part of the form, we had to have the live Zoom transcription going for all the rehearsals, so that Murph was able to key into what else was going on around them. And I think just brought a fantastic mercuriality to it, if you like. I mean, it's a bold device to go, I'm going to resurrect a dead pre-Chaucerian author to come on and tell you a story within a story. And have like an actual historical figure telling you about a completely different area and time and part of history. It's really wild, but I thought some of the choices that were made there were amazing. But I can only really talk about Pericles as a fan, because I deliberately stepped back and I deliberately made that space for Maz to occupy and then got the hell out of the way, because that felt like the right thing to do, basically. In terms of lessons to take from it, forgiveness is always a good thing, right? Personal growth and change is always a good thing. Being mindful that everyone that you meet has suffered some kind of hardship is always a nice lesson to be reminded of. I think what Maz did with the casting of it and again, it's a very globe-trotting play. It's very cinematic, like Antony and Cleopatra is, and it's another tour of the tropes in the way that Cymbeline is. And so I thought that Maz managed to pick up on the cues that were established, take up that baton that we created and then really drive it and run it forward into that production and take ownership of it. I thought she did a fantastic job.
We've talked a lot in our class about how the show must go online is associated with digital theater. It's very state-of-the-art, it's cutting edge, but so many of the performance solutions were very low tech. I found an object around my house and I was able to turn it into this prop. And it allows you to kind of get a sense of maybe what it would have been like to try to stage these plays in the Elizabethan era, the Jacobean era, to figure out how can I do this perhaps a little bit crude, symbolic, theatrical work that's going to activate the audience's imagination. And they're going to be paying attention to the story that I'm trying to tell, but they're also going to be a little bit fascinated by the creativity that I'm bringing to the story and the way that I tell it. And I think for a lot of us, that sense of a kind of double vision of focus on the Shakespearean story, but focus on the show must go online's creativity and performing the story is really the magic of this past year of productions. But I do want to just end on a quick note, I guess a note about creativity here. I think it is so amazing and so fascinating. First of all, that Rob, thank you for joining our Why Shakespeare class and becoming part of this conversation that we're having here. Why Shakespeare students, thank you for becoming a part of the Show Must Go Online community and the amazing energy that they've got going on there. it's amazing to me that if I look at the students in this room right now, you know, you are some of the world's leading experts on these plays as performed by The Show Must Go Online. I think it speaks to the fact that in our class, the academic writing we're doing, we're not just going through the motions. This is work that matters. You are creating knowledge that future people will be able to use when they come to these plays and they think about these plays. And by the same token, The Show Must Go Online, Rob, the creation that happened over the past year, you know, to bring these things into existence and to bring just so much kind of, whether it's escapism from what's going on in this world that seems to be just turned on its head all around us, or whether it's giving us a new way to think about this world that we're living in. Kind of the creativity there is so amazing that these things now exist that previously they didn't. And why Shakespeare students, maybe we should have mentioned this earlier, Rob. I hope it's okay that I say this, but Rob has been talking with us today while he is himself expecting a child to be born at any minute, maybe in fact a few days ago. And I think, Rob, for my part, I'll just say of the amazing things that you've created this past year, of course, that will be the most important one. So congratulations, and let's all thank Rob for coming into our class. And Rob, I'll see you momentarily. The rest of you, looking forward to conferences, conversations, seeing how these ideas develop. Let's thank Rob one more time. And Show Must Go Online fashion, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Amazing, amazing questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.